Welcome back, dear listeners, to another soothing journey back in time. As you settle in for a restful slumber, I invite you to pause for a moment and leave a comment sharing where in the world you're joining us from and what time of day it is for you right now. It's always a delight to see the global reach of our little community of history enthusiasts and insomniacs. And if you're new here and find yourself enjoying these calm, meandering tales from yesteryear, we'd be ever so grateful if you consider hitting that subscribe button. Now, let's gently wade into tonight's topic, shall we? Picture, if you will, a bustling medieval European town. The cobblestone streets echo with the clatter of horse hooves and the shouts of merchants peddling their wares. But amidst the vibrant tapestry of sights and sounds, there's an undercurrent that might seem a bit, well, unsavory to our modern sensibilities. Yes, tonight we'll be delving into the oft-maligned world of medieval hygiene. But fear not, dear listeners, for while some of the practices we'll uncover may indeed seem nightmarish through the lens of contemporary standards, our goal is not to pass judgment or elicit disgust. Rather, we'll seek to understand how these customs evolved over time as people grappled with the challenges of cleanliness using the knowledge and resources available to them. So let's approach this, not with a wrinkled nose, but with an open mind and a dash of empathy for our medieval forebears. As we embark on this journey through the annals of historical hygiene, we'll traipse through the muck-filled streets dodging chamber pots, peek behind the curtain of the public bathhouse, recoil at the lice-ridden coifs of nobility, and perhaps even develop a newfound appreciation for the humble bar of soap. But more than just a highlight reel of hygienic horrors, we'll meet a colourful cast of characters along the way, from the smelly legacy of Queen Isabella of Castile to the surprisingly advanced dental practices of barber surgeons. So snuggle up, dear listeners, and let the gentle cadence of medieval history lull you into a peaceful slumber. And if you happen to awaken with a renewed gratitude for your morning shower and toothbrush, well, that's just a bonus. Our story begins, as many medieval tales do, with a distinct lack of understanding about the microscopic world of germs and disease. In an era long before the germ theory of disease took hold, folks had to rely on their own powers of observation and deduction to make sense of the maladies that plagued them. And one conclusion that seemed to crop up time and again was the idea that bad smells, or miasmas, were the root of all illness. It's not hard to see how this belief took hold, especially when one considers the olfactory assault that was the average medieval city. Open sewers gurgled and belched their fetid contents right into the streets, mingling with the dung of livestock and the occasional heap of rotting garbage. Chamber pots were unceremoniously dumped from windows, their contents splattering onto the heads of unfortunate passers-by. The very air was thick with the stench of human and animal waste. But for the average medieval city dweller, this was all just part of the daily sensory landscape. The miasma theory of disease wouldn't be officially put to rest until the late 19th century. So for centuries, people just held their noses and went about their business. Imagine, if you will, the plight of the common peasant navigating these filthy streets. With each step, their bare feet would squelch through the muck, the fetid sludge oozing between their toes. Dodging the contents of chamber pots would become an art form, a daily dance of dexterity. And should they fail to sidestep the falling filth, well, it was just another layer to add to their already pungent aroma. But it wasn't just the streets that were awash in waste. The very rivers that served as the lifeblood of medieval cities were often little more than open sewers themselves. The same waterways that were used for drinking, cooking, and bathing were also the dumping grounds for all manner of human and animal waste. Tanneries and dye works would discharge their noxious chemicals directly into the rivers, turning them a rainbow of unnatural hues. Enter the unsung hero of the medieval era, the washerwoman. Armed with little more than a wooden paddle and a bar of crude soap, These women would wade into the polluted rivers to beat the filth out of clothing and linens. It was backbreaking work, and the constant exposure to contaminated water no doubt took its toll on their health. But in a time when cleanliness was more a luxury than a necessity, their services were in high demand. As the washerwoman toils away on the riverbank, pounding the dirt out of a noblewoman's delicate undergarments, let's take a moment to consider her daily lot in life. Her hands are chapped and raw from the constant exposure to cold water and harsh lye soap. The stench of the river permeates her clothing and hair, a pungent musk that no amount of scrubbing can quite eliminate. And should she pause in her labours to wipe the sweat from her brow, she must take care not to let the grimy river water touch her face, lest she risk contracting any number of waterborne illnesses. But for all the hardships endured by the medieval washerwoman, there were glimmers of progress on the horizon. Slowly but surely, the idea of underground sewers and organised waste removal began to take hold in some of the more forward-thinking cities. In the 12th century London, for example, the aptly named Great Drain was constructed to carry waste away from the city centre. It was a rudimentary system, to be sure, but it marked a crucial first step in the long journey towards modern sanitation. Of course, the washerwoman's lot was not an enviable one, but at least she had regular access to water, polluted though it may be. For the average medieval person, bathing was a far less frequent affair. The prevailing wisdom of the time held that bathing too often could actually be harmful to one's health, as it was thought to remove protective layers of dirt and oil from the skin. As a result, most people made do with a quick splash of water to the face and hands, reserving full-body immersion for special occasions. When one did deign to take a proper bath, it was often more about socializing than getting clean. Public bathhouses were a common fixture in medieval cities, and they served as a gathering place for people from all walks of life. Men and women would soak together in large communal tubs, often while enjoying food, drink, and lively conversation. These bathhouses were more akin to modern-day spas or social clubs than the utilitarian cleaning stations we think of today. But lest you think that a trip to the bathhouse was all good, clean fun, let's take a peek behind the curtain with a noble couple out for a day of leisure. As they disrobe and slip into the steaming water, they're greeted by a sight that would make most modern bathers recoil in horror. The water is murky and opaque, teeming with the sweat, dirt, and dead skin cells of countless previous occupants. The air is thick with steam and the pungent aroma of unwashed bodies. And if one were to look closely, they might even spot the occasional flea or louse swimming lazily by. For our noble couple, however, this is all par for the course. They settle in, letting the warm water soothe their aching muscles as they exchange the latest court gossip with their fellow bathers. But as the heat begins to take its toll, they find themselves growing lightheaded and nauseous. You see, in an era when bloodletting was considered a cure-all for most ailments, the combination of hot water and open wounds could often lead to fainting spells or even death. But even if one managed to survive the perils of the bathhouse, there was still the matter of what to do about the inevitable body odour that would follow. Without regular bathing, most medieval folks had to rely on perfumes and scented powders to mask their natural musk. These concoctions were often made from exotic ingredients like musk, ambergris and civet, and were applied liberally to clothing, hair and skin. Of course, not everyone had access to these pricey perfumes. For the common folk, the solution was often to simply embrace their own bodily funk. And in some cases, that funk could be truly legendary. Take, for example, the case of Queen Isabella of Castile, who was said to have bathed only twice in her entire life, once at birth and once on her wedding day. The rest of the time, she relied on a liberal dousing of perfume to keep her royal aroma in check. But while Queen Isabella's smelly legacy may be an extreme example, she was far from alone in her aversion to bathing. Many medieval people subscribed to the belief that water could actually be dangerous to one's health, as it was thought to let disease into the body through the pores of the skin. This fear of water extended to all aspects of hygiene, including the care of one's teeth and gums. In a time before toothbrushes and fluoride toothpaste, most people had to make do with a quick rub of a cloth or a finger dipped in abrasive substances like salt, chalk, or ground eggshells. As you might imagine, this did little to combat the buildup of plaque and tartar, and tooth decay was rampant. It was not uncommon for people to have lost most of their teeth by the time they reached middle age, and those who did manage to keep a few chompers often had to contend with constant pain and infection. Even the nobility were not immune to the ravages of poor dental hygiene. Queen Elizabeth I, for example, was known for her love of sugary treats, which no doubt contributed to her notoriously rotten teeth. By the time she reached her 60s, she was said to have only a few blackened stumps left in her mouth, and her breath was so foul that her courtiers would often hold perfumed handkerchiefs to their noses in her presence. But while the average medieval person may have had to suffer through a lifetime of dental woes, there were some surprising advances being made in the field of dentistry. Enter the barber surgeon, a jack of all trades, who not only cut hair and trimmed beards, but also performed a wide range of medical procedures, including tooth extractions and oral surgery. These barber surgeons were often the go-to guys for dental care, and they developed some surprisingly sophisticated techniques for dealing with troublesome teeth. They would use a variety of tools, including pliers, forceps, and even specially designed keys, to wiggle and wrench out rotten molars and incisors. And if a tooth was too far gone to save, they would simply yank it out and cauterize the wound with a hot iron to prevent infection. But while the barber surgeons may have been the medieval equivalent of a trip to the dentist, they were not exactly known for their gentle bedside manner. A visit to the barber surgeon was often a painful and traumatic experience, and many patients would put off seeking treatment until their teeth were in a truly dire state. And speaking of dire states, let's turn our attention to the matter of hair care in the medieval world. Much like with teeth, the average person's hair was often a tangled, matted mess, crawling with lice and other unsavory critters. Combs and brushes were a rare luxury, and most people simply let their hair grow wild and free, washing it only on the rarest of occasions. But for the wealthy and powerful, unkempt hair was simply not an option. Enter the lice-ridden wig, a fashion staple of the medieval elite. These wigs were often made from human hair, wool, or even horsehair, and were powdered and perfumed to within an inch of their lives in an attempt to conceal their less than hygienic origins. One notable wearer of these wigs was King Louis XIII of France, who was said to have had a head full of lice so severe that his attendants would often find the critters crawling onto their own clothes and skin. But rather than addressing the root of the problem, pun intended, Louis simply had his servants shave his head and replace his natural hair with an ever-rotating collection of increasingly elaborate wigs. Of course, not everyone could afford the luxury of a wig, and for the common folk, lice were simply a fact of life. Lice combs, made from bone, wood, or ivory, were a common tool for trying to keep the critters at bay, but it was often a losing battle. In fact, the problem of lice was so widespread that it actually gave rise to a whole new profession, the lice picker. These intrepid individuals would make their living by going from house to house, offering to pick the lice and nits out of people's hair for a small fee. It was a dirty and tedious job, but in a world where hygiene was often an afterthought, it was a surprisingly lucrative one. But while the lice pickers may have provided a temporary solution to the problem of head lice, they could do little to address the larger issue of disease in the medieval world. With open sewers, polluted water, and a general lack of understanding about the importance of hygiene, medieval cities were essentially giant petri dishes for all sorts of nasty illnesses. Perhaps the most notorious of these was the Black Death, a pandemic of bubonic plague that swept through Europe in the 14th century, killing an estimated 30 to 60% of the population. The disease was spread by fleas that lived on rats, which thrived in the filthy conditions of medieval cities. And with no understanding of how the disease was transmitted, people were essentially helpless to stop its spread. Imagine, if you will, the plight of a typical plague victim. It would start with a feeling of general malaise, followed by the appearance of oozing, pus-filled boils on the skin. As the disease progressed, the victim would experience high fevers, chills, and excruciating pain as their lymph nodes swelled to the size of eggs. In the final stages, the skin would turn black and gangrenous as the body essentially began to rot from the inside out. It was a gruesome and terrifying way to die, and the sheer scale of the devastation left by the Black Death is almost impossible to fathom. Entire villages were wiped out, and the social and economic fabric of medieval society was forever changed. But even in the face of such unimaginable horror, people still clung to the idea that bad smells were the root of all disease. Doctors would often wear long, beaked masks stuffed with herbs and spices, believing that the fragrant scents would protect them from the miasmas that were thought to carry the plague. They would also carry long sticks, which they used to examine patients from a safe distance, lest they risk contracting the disease themselves. Of course, we now know that these measures did little to actually prevent the spread of the plague, but they do serve as a powerful reminder of just how little people understood about disease in the medieval world. It would take centuries of scientific advancement and public health campaigns to finally begin to turn the tide against the scourge of infectious disease. But even as the Black Death faded into memory, the general lack of hygiene in medieval society continued to take its toll. People often wore the same clothes for months or even years on end, rarely washing them and simply letting the dirt and sweat build up until they were little more than tattered rags. Bathing was still seen as a largely optional activity, and most people went through life with a permanent layer of grime on their skin. Even in the relative cleanliness of medieval convents and monasteries, hygiene was often an afterthought. Nuns and monks were expected to cover their bodies from head to toe at all times, even while sleeping, and bathing was seen as a temptation to sin. As a result, many religious orders had strict rules around personal hygiene, with some allowing their members to bathe only once or twice a year. But while the lack of cleanliness may seem appalling to us today, it's important to remember that for most medieval people, a certain level of body odor was simply a normal part of life. In fact, some even saw it as a sign of virility or attractiveness. Henry VIII, for example, was said to have once requested a lady's unwashed undergarments as a token of her affection, believing that her natural scent would be a powerful aphrodisiac. But while Henry's amorous intentions may have been misguided, his actions do serve as a reminder of just how different attitudes towards hygiene were in the medieval world. For most people, cleanliness was simply not a top priority, and the idea of daily bathing or regular toothbrushing would have seemed like a ridiculous luxury. Of course, this is not to say that medieval people were entirely unconcerned with their appearance or their health. They simply had a different set of priorities and a different understanding of how the body worked. And in many cases, the medical practices of the time were actually doing more harm than good. Take, for example, the practice of bloodletting, which was seen as a cure-all for everything from headaches to the plague. The idea was that by draining a certain amount of blood from the body, you could rid it of any harmful humours or toxins that were causing disease. But in reality, all it did was weaken the patient and make them more susceptible to infection. Even some of the most famous figures in history were not immune to the dangers of bloodletting. George Washington, for example, died after being bled multiple times by his doctors in an attempt to cure a sore throat. And while Washington's case may be ended, our journey through the grimy streets of medieval Europe continues as we explore the infrequent and often ineffective bathing practices of the time. While today a daily shower is the norm for many, in the Middle Ages, people had a very different relationship with washing their bodies. Bathing was an irregular affair, often done only a few times a year, if at all. Many believed that washing away the layer of grime on their skin would actually remove a protective barrier against disease. They thought that immersing the body in water would allow illness to seep in through the pores. Oh, if only they had known about the armies of microbes wreaking havoc beneath the surface. Even when medieval folks did brave a bath, it was a far cry from the solitary, hygienic experience we enjoy today. Public bathhouses were the primary venue, but they were more about socializing than scrubbing. Men and women crowded together in these steamy, murky pools, which were infrequently changed and ripe with bacteria. Imagine, if you will, a noble couple venturing out for a visit to their local bathhouse. They arrived to find the air thick with steam and chatter, the pungent aroma of bodies packed in close quarters, assaulting their nostrils. Gingerly, they disrobe and wade into the cloudy, tepid water. As they attempt to navigate the sea of naked limbs and engage in polite conversation with their neighbors, they can't help but wonder about the last time this bath was emptied and refreshed. The fear of what lurks beneath the surface dampens any relaxation or cleansing they might have hoped for. For royalty, one might expect a higher standard of hygiene to prevail. Alas, even the most regal noses were not spared the funk of infrequent bathing. Take Queen Isabella I of Castile, a woman renowned for her fierceness on the battlefield and her support of Christopher Columbus. Despite her power and influence, Isabella had a rather smelly legacy. It's said that she only bathed twice in her entire life, once at birth and once on her wedding day. One can only imagine the royal odor that followed her around the castle. To combat the inevitable stench that accumulated on unwashed bodies, the elite turned to perfumes and scented powders. They would douse themselves in fragrant concoctions made from flowers, herbs, and spices, hoping to mask the pungent reality beneath. It was a case of covering one overpowering smell with another, an olfactory assault that must have left many a nose twitching. As the medieval world began to slowly awaken to the importance of hygiene, bathing did become slightly more frequent among certain groups. Monks, for example, were often required to bathe several times a year, and hand-washing became a regular practice in some monasteries. However, the water they used was often recycled and far from sterile. It's fascinating to consider how different our attitudes towards bathing are today. We strip down and step under the warm, clean spray of a shower without a second thought, lathering up with soap and washing away the grime of the day. Our medieval ancestors, on the other hand, spent most of their lives marinating in their own sweat and bacteria, with only the occasional dip in a communal bath to break up the build-up. As we drift off to sleep, let's take a moment to appreciate the simple luxury of a daily shower and the advancements in plumbing and hygiene that have made it possible. The next time you turn on the tap and feel the water cascading over you, spare a thought for your medieval counterparts who had to navigate a world where cleanliness was a rarity and body odor was just a fact of life. Of course, bathing was just one piece of the medieval hygiene puzzle. As we continue our journey through this fascinating and sometimes frightening time, we'll delve into the oral hygiene practices that left many a medieval mouth in a sorry state. From rotting teeth to breath that could fell an ox, the story of medieval dental care is not for the faint of heart. But first, let us rest and allow our minds to wander through the steamy, pungent bathhouses of centuries past, grateful for the simple, solitary showers we enjoy today. King Louis XIII of France was another unfortunate soul plagued by lice. Born in 1601, Louis ascended to the throne at the tender age of 8 after the assassination of his father, Henry IV. As a young boy, Louis was sickly and frail, with a host of health issues that would follow him throughout his life. But perhaps his most persistent tormentors were the tiny, crawling creatures that infested his hair and clothing. Like many of his royal contemporaries, Louis sported long, flowing locks that were seldom washed. It was the fashion of the time for both men and women to keep their hair long, often past the shoulders. But with this style came the ever-present threat of lice. These minuscule parasites would make their homes in the warm, dark recesses of the hair, feeding on the blood of their hosts and laying their eggs, known as nits, on the hair shafts. For Louis, the problem was particularly acute. His hair was said to be thick and lustrous, a crowning glory that would have been the envy of many. But beneath this majestic mane lurked a seething mass of lice, their numbers growing by the day. The young king was constantly scratching and clawing at his scalp, finding little relief from the maddening itch. In an attempt to conceal his lice-ridden locks, Louis took to wearing elaborate wigs. These hairpieces, made from human or horsehair, allowed him to maintain the appearance of a well-groomed monarch while hiding the unsightly reality beneath. But the wigs themselves soon became infested, providing yet another breeding ground for the persistent pests. The royal court was no stranger to lice, of course. In the close, often unsanitary conditions of the palace, lice could spread like wildfire from one head to another. Courtiers would discreetly scratch at their own scalps during long, tedious ceremonies, trying to maintain an air of decorum while secretly battling their own infestations. For the common folk, lice were an even more ubiquitous presence. In the crowded, filthy streets of Paris and other cities, lice were simply a fact of life. People would pick them from each other's hair as a gesture of social grooming, or use crude combs made of bone or wood to try to keep the numbers in check. But in a world without modern hygiene or effective treatments, the lice always seemed to have the upper hand. Louis XIII's struggles with lice were just one small part of the larger tapestry of poor hygiene in medieval Europe. From the lowliest peasant to the highest king, no one was immune to the effects of this persistent neglect, the constant itching, the crawling sensation of tiny feet on the scalp, the social stigma of visible infestation. All were part and parcel of daily life. But amidst this grim reality, there were glimmers of hope and progress. As the Middle Ages gave way to the Renaissance and beyond, new ideas about hygiene and cleanliness began to take hold. Gradually, the practice of regular bathing became more widespread, and the use of soap and other cleansing agents more common. Wigs, too, fell out of fashion as more natural hairstyles came into vogue. For Louis XIII, however, these changes would come too late. He would die in 1643, at the age of 41, his health broken by a lifetime of illness and infirmity. But his legacy would live on, not just in the annals of French history, but in the cautionary tales of medieval hygiene that continue to fascinate and horrify us to this day. As we lay our heads down to sleep, we can take comfort in the knowledge that we live in a world of hot showers, clean sheets, and effective lice treatments. But spare a thought for poor Louis XIII and his ilk, scratching through the night in their lice-ridden beds, dreaming of a future where the only thing crawling on their heads would be the occasional errant thought. Sweet dreams, dear listener, and may your scalp remain forever free of uninvited guests. Lice combs, those small, unassuming tools that played such a vital role in the battle against head lice, have a surprisingly long and varied history. While today we might think of them as a last resort, to be used only in cases of severe infestation, in medieval times they were a staple of daily hygiene for rich and poor alike. The earliest known lice combs date back to ancient Egypt, where they were carved from ivory or bone. These early combs were likely used not just for lice, but for general grooming and styling of the hair. The Egyptians placed a high value on personal appearance, and combs of various types were an important part of their daily routines. As the centuries passed, lice combs spread throughout the world, taking on different forms and materials depending on the culture and resources available. In medieval Europe, lice combs were often made of wood or bone, with closely spaced teeth designed to catch and remove both adult lice and their eggs. The use of these combs was a regular part of medieval hygiene, particularly among the lower classes who could not afford the luxuries of frequent bathing or washing of clothes. Mothers would sit with their children, painstakingly combing through their hair and picking out the lice and nits one by one. This practice was known as nitpicking, a term that has since come to mean the careful, detailed removal of any small, unwanted elements. For the wealthy, lice combs were often more elaborate affairs, crafted from precious materials like ivory or tortoiseshell. These combs were as much a symbol of status as a practical tool, and were often adorned with intricate carvings or inlaid with gold or silver. But no matter the material or the design, the basic function of the lice comb remained the same: to provide some measure of relief from the constant itching and crawling of these persistent parasites. In a world where head lice were simply a fact of life, the lice comb was an essential weapon in the daily battle for comfort and cleanliness. Interestingly, the use of lice combs was not limited to humans. In medieval falconry, a popular pastime among the nobility, lice combs were used to groom and maintain the health of these prized birds of prey. Falconers would carefully comb through the feathers of their hawks and falcons, removing any lice or other parasites that might compromise the bird's health or performance. As the centuries passed and new methods of lice treatment and prevention emerged, the lice comb gradually fell out of favor. Today, they are mostly used in cases of severe infestation, or as a complementary treatment alongside medicated shampoos and other products. But the legacy of the lice comb lives on, not just in the occasional outbreak of head lice in schools and homes, but in the broader history of human hygiene and the never-ending battle against parasites and disease. So the next time you find yourself scratching absent-mindedly at your scalp, spare a thought for the humble lice comb and the countless generations who relied on it for relief and comfort, in a world where personal hygiene was a far cry from the standards we enjoy today. And take heart in the knowledge that no matter how bad your own lice situation might seem, it pales in comparison to the trials and tribulations of our medieval ancestors. Now, as the tale of the lice comb comes to a close, let us drift off to sleep with a newfound appreciation for the simple pleasures of a clean, comfortable head. Good night and sweet dreams. As we continue our journey through the often grim landscape of medieval hygiene, we come to perhaps the most lucrative and least appreciated profession of the time: the lice picker. In a world where head lice were as common as dirt and about as welcome, these intrepid individuals made their living by quite literally picking the pests off of other people's heads. Imagine, if you will, a typical street scene in a medieval city. Amidst the clamour of merchants hawking their wares and the stench of open sewers, you might come across a small, unassuming stall with a simple sign: lice picking. Behind the stall sits a wizened old woman, her fingers gnarled from years of plucking and pulling at the tiny, wriggling creatures that infest the heads of her clients. For a few coins, she will sit you down on a low stool and begin her work, her sharp eyes and nimble fingers quickly locating and removing the adult lice and their eggs from your hair. It's a tedious, time-consuming process, but one that offers a modicum of relief from the constant itching and scratching that plagues so many in this era. The lice picker's trade was not for the faint of heart. Lice were not just unpleasant, but could also carry diseases like typhus, which could be passed on to the picker if they were not careful. Many pickers would develop a keen eye for the signs of infestation and would refuse to work on particularly severe cases for fear of contracting an illness themselves. But for those who could stomach the work, lice picking could be a surprisingly lucrative profession. In a society where regular bathing was a luxury and head lice were a near universal problem, there was no shortage of clients willing to pay for a bit of relief. Some lice pickers would even travel from town to town, setting up shop in busy marketplaces and offering their services to weary travelers and locals alike. Of course, not everyone could afford the services of a professional lice picker. For the poor, lice picking was often a family affair, with mothers and grandmothers spending hours combing through their children's hair in an attempt to keep the infestation under control. In some cases, entire families would gather together for a lice-picking party, making a social event out of the grim but necessary task. As unpleasant as the work may have been, lice pickers played an important role in medieval society. In a world without modern medicine or hygiene practices, they offered a small but vital service that could mean the difference between constant misery and a modicum of comfort. So the next time you find yourself complaining about a bad hair day or a minor itch, spare a thought for the medieval lice picker and the countless hours they spent plucking and picking at the heads of their fellow citizens. And take comfort in the knowledge that, no matter how bad your own hair situation might seem, it's nothing compared to the trials and tribulations of our lousy ancestors. Now, as we drift off to sleep, let us dream of a world free from the tyranny of head lice, where the only thing crawling on our scalps is the occasional errant thought or flight of fancy. Good night, and may your dreams be free of tiny, unwelcome visitors. As the medieval world began to give way to the early modern era, the spectre of disease loomed large over daily life. In a time before germ theory or modern medicine, epidemics could sweep through cities and towns with terrifying speed, leaving death and despair in their wake. And perhaps no disease was more feared or more devastating than the dreaded Black Death. The Black Death, also known as the bubonic plague, first arrived in Europe in the mid-14th century, likely carried by fleas on the backs of rats from Asia. It quickly spread throughout the continent, reaching England, France, Germany, and beyond in a matter of months. The disease was characterized by fever, chills, and the appearance of swollen, painful lumps called buboes in the lymph nodes of the neck, armpits, and groin. For those who contracted the plague, the outlook was grim. Without antibiotics or other modern treatments, the disease had a mortality rate of around 50 to 70%. Victims would often die within days of showing symptoms, their bodies racked with pain and fever as the bacteria ravaged their internal organs. In medieval cities, where hygiene was poor and living conditions were cramped and unsanitary, the plague found an ideal breeding ground. Fleas thrived in the dirty, crowded streets, jumping easily from rat to human and spreading the disease with alarming efficiency. Once the plague took hold in a city, it was nearly impossible to contain. The social and economic impacts of the Black Death were devastating. Entire families were wiped out, leaving orphaned children and abandoned homes in their wake. Businesses closed, trade ground to a halt, and crops rotted in the fields as there were simply not enough people left alive to tend to them. In some areas, up to half the population died, leaving a grim landscape of empty villages and mass graves. One of the most haunting images of the Black Death comes from the Italian writer Giovanni Boccaccio, who chronicled the plague's arrival in Florence in 1348. In his book, The Decameron, he describes the grisly demise of a plague victim. The violence of the plague was so great that the victim not only lost consciousness, but seemed to be dead for all the world. And then, not in one case or a few, but in many, it happened that those who were thought to be dead were carried out of their houses and thrown into pits with the others, sometimes still alive. The image of bodies piled in mass graves, some still clinging to life, is a chilling reminder of the brutality of the disease and the helplessness of those who faced it. In the face of such unimaginable horror, it's perhaps not surprising that medieval people turned to superstition and religion for comfort. Some blamed the plague on divine punishment for sin. while others turned to prayer and penitence in hopes of warding off the disease. Flagellants, groups of religious zealots who whipped themselves in public as a form of penance, became a common sight in plague-stricken cities. But amidst the chaos and despair, there were also glimmers of hope and resilience. In some cities, public health measures like quarantines and the disposal of bodies were put in place in an attempt to slow the spread of the disease. And in the aftermath of the plague, society began to slowly rebuild, with new opportunities emerging for the survivors. As we lay our heads down to sleep, let us take a moment to remember the victims of the Black Death and the countless other epidemics that have shaped human history. And let us be grateful for the advances in medicine and hygiene that have made such devastating outbreaks a thing of the past, at least in much of the modern world. Now, let the grim spectres of the plague fade away into the mists of history, and let us drift off into a dreamless, disease-free slumber. Good night, and may your sleep be untroubled by the ghosts of pandemics past. As the Black Death raged across Europe, claiming countless lives and leaving devastation in its wake, a new and unsettling figure began to appear on the streets of plague-stricken cities: the Plague Doctor. Clad in long black robes and wearing a distinctive beaked mask, these grim spectres became a symbol of the terror and despair that gripped the continent during this dark time. But who were these plague doctors? And what role did they play in the fight against the disease? In truth, the answer is a bit more complicated than the ominous image might suggest. Plague doctors were often second-rate physicians or even charlatans who were hired by cities to treat plague victims. At a time when many doctors were fleeing the cities to escape the disease, these individuals stepped in to fill the void, offering their services to the desperate and dying. The most striking feature of the plague doctor's attire was the beaked mask, which was stuffed with herbs, straw, and spices. The idea behind this was that the disease was spread by miasma, or bad air, and that the fragrant herbs would purify the air and prevent the doctor from breathing in the harmful vapors. In reality, of course, the beaked mask did little to protect the wearer from the disease. Plague doctors were just as susceptible to the Black Death as anyone else, and many fell victim to the very illness they were trying to treat. But the mask did serve a psychological purpose, creating a barrier between the doctor and the patient, and perhaps providing a small measure of comfort to those who were suffering. Plague doctors were often tasked with the grim duty of examining the dead and dying, looking for signs of the disease and marking houses where the plague had struck. They would carry long wooden sticks, which they used to examine patients from a distance, and to remove clothing and bedding from infected homes. Treatment options were limited and often ineffective. Plague doctors would lance the buboes and apply poultices made from herbs and oils, but these did little to halt the progress of the disease. Some doctors resorted to more extreme measures, like bloodletting or even the use of live chickens to draw out the poisonous vapors from the patient's body. Despite their best efforts, plague doctors were often viewed with suspicion and even hostility by the public. Many people saw them as harbingers of death, arriving only to confirm the presence of the plague and to mark the doomed for burial. In some cases, plague doctors were even attacked or driven out of town by angry mobs. As the plague began to wane in the late 14th century, the figure of the plague doctor gradually faded from the streets of Europe. But their legacy lived on in art, literature, and popular culture, where they became a symbol of the grim realities of life in the Middle Ages. Today, the image of the plague doctor has taken on a new resonance in the face of modern pandemics like COVID-19. The sight of healthcare workers clad in protective gear, bravely treating the sick and dying, echoes the sacrifices made by their medieval counterparts. And the lessons of the Black Death, the importance of public health measures, the need for compassion and solidarity in the face of crisis, remain as relevant as ever. As we drift off to sleep, Let us spare a thought for the plague doctors of old and the healthcare workers of today who risk their own lives to bring comfort and care to those in need. And let us dream of a world where such sacrifices are no longer necessary, where disease and suffering. As we walk through the streets of this typical medieval town, the stench of waste and decay assaults our nostrils. Chamber pots are dumped from windows above, their contents splattering onto the dirt roads. We must watch our step to avoid the fetid puddles and piles of excrement left by both humans and animals. It's a far cry from the sanitized streets we're accustomed to today. The people of the Middle Ages had no concept of germs or the importance of sanitation in preventing disease. They saw no problem with tossing their waste into the streets, letting it fester in the open air. In larger cities, the accumulation of filth was even more pronounced. London's streets were said to be ankle-deep in a foul-smelling slurry of mud, excrement, and rotting food scraps. Imagine for a moment that you are a peasant living in one of these towns. Every morning, you must navigate the noisome obstacles just to go about your daily business. The stench is overwhelming, but you're so accustomed to it that you barely notice anymore. You might occasionally hold a scented handkerchief to your nose to ward off the worst of the odours, but there's no escaping the ever-present reek. As bad as the streets were, the rivers that flowed through medieval towns were often even worse. They served as both drinking water sources and convenient spots for dumping waste. Privies were frequently built to overhang rivers, allowing the waste to drop directly into the water. Downstream, people blithely drank, bathed, and washed their clothes in the same polluted water. Picture a medieval washerwoman kneeling at the banks of one of these rivers. She beats the clothing against the rocks, the suds mingling with the murky water. Nearby, a group of children splash and play, heedless of the contamination. The washerwoman knows the water is far from clean, but there are no other options. She rinses the clothes as best she can and spreads them out on the bushes to dry in the sun. It's no wonder that waterborne illnesses like dysentery and typhoid fever were rampant in the Middle Ages. Without proper sanitation, disease spread quickly through communities. It wasn't until the late medieval period that some cities began to construct underground sewers to carry waste away from the streets. Even then, it was a slow and piecemeal process. The idea of a citywide sanitation system was still centuries away. But while the streets and rivers were undoubtedly filthy, one might assume that people of the Middle Ages at least kept their own bodies clean. Unfortunately, personal hygiene was just as lacking as public sanitation. Bathing was an infrequent practice, often seen as more of a luxury than a necessity. There were several reasons for this aversion to bathing. For one, it was believed that stripping away the body's natural oils and odours left a person vulnerable to disease. The exposed skin and open pores were thought to be entry points for sickness to invade the body. Some medical texts of the time even warned against bathing too frequently, claiming it could upset the balance of the body's humours. This is not to say that bathing was completely unheard of in the Middle Ages. Public bathhouses were a common feature in many towns, but they were more about socialising than getting clean. Men and women bathed together in large communal tubs, often while enjoying food, drink and entertainment. The water was rarely changed, so by the end of the day, it was more like a tepid soup of dirt, sweat, and who knows what else. Imagine a noble couple visiting one of these bathhouses for the first time. They arrive in their finest attire, eager to see and be seen. As they disrobe and step into the murky water, they try to hide their disgust at the floating debris and cloudy appearance. Nearby, a group of men play dice and swap bawdy jokes, their laughter echoing off the stone walls. The couple exchange uneasy glances, suddenly realizing that this may not be the relaxing, cleansing experience they had anticipated. For those who couldn't afford the bathhouse or simply chose not to go, a quick sponge bath might suffice. But even then, The water was often recycled from cooking or washing, and soap was a luxury item reserved for the wealthy. Most people relied on scrubbing with sand or ashes to get rid of the worst of the grime. The aversion to bathing was so ingrained that even some of the most powerful people in Europe were known for their lack of personal hygiene. Queen Isabella I of Castile, who funded Christopher Columbus's voyages to the New World, was said to have only bathed twice in her entire life, once at birth and once before her wedding. Her successor, Queen Elizabeth I of England, was not much better. It's said that she took a bath once a month, whether she needed it or not. But while the nobility might have been able to get away with infrequent bathing, the lower classes had to find other ways to mask their body odor. Perfumes and scented powders were popular among those who could afford them. The idea was to cover up the stench rather than eliminate it at the source. Heavy musk scents were particularly favored, as they were thought to ward off disease-carrying miasmas. Of course, all the perfume in the world couldn't make up for the deplorable state of oral hygiene in the Middle Ages. Dental care was rudimentary at best, and most people simply accepted tooth decay and foul breath as a fact of life. Without regular brushing or access to modern dental tools, teeth rotted away, causing intense pain and difficulty eating. Some people did make attempts to clean their teeth, but the methods were often more harmful than helpful. Rubbing the teeth with abrasive substances like salt, chalk, or ground-up shells was common. While this might have removed some of the surface stains, it also wore away the tooth enamel over time. Others chewed on twigs or used rough cloths to scrub away the buildup, but these methods were minimally effective at best. Even the highest echelons of society suffered from poor dental health. Queen Elizabeth I, despite her access to the best medical care of the time, was known for her blackened, rotting teeth. It's said that she was so self-conscious about her smile that she stuffed bits of cloth between her teeth to hide the decay. But while the Queen might have been able to afford some rudimentary dental care, the average person was left to suffer through the pain of toothaches and gum disease. Tooth extraction was often the only solution, and it was a grisly affair performed by barber surgeons with little anesthesia beyond a stiff drink. Surprisingly, some barber surgeons of the Middle Ages had relatively advanced knowledge of dental practices. They used specialized tools like dental picks and files to remove decay and shape the teeth. Some even crafted primitive dentures from bone or ivory to replace missing teeth. Of course, these procedures were still painful and risky, but they offered a glimmer of hope for those suffering from severe dental problems. As for hair hygiene, the Middle Ages were a veritable paradise for lice. With infrequent washing and a lack of effective delousing treatments, most people's hair was a breeding ground for the pesky insects. Lice were so common that having a few crawling in one's hair was considered normal, even among the upper classes. Take King Louis XIII of France, for example. Despite his access to the finest grooming products and servants, his ornate wigs were said to be constantly infested with lice. The king was so accustomed to the itching and scratching that he hardly seemed to notice the bugs crawling through his hairpieces. For those who couldn't afford wigs, the solution was often to simply cover the hair with a cap or hood. This helped to contain the lice and hide the evidence of infestation. Some people also used special combs made of bone, wood, or ivory to remove the bugs and nits from the hair. But without regular washing, it was a losing battle. In fact, lice were so ubiquitous in medieval society that there was even a thriving industry built around their removal. Professional night pickers, often women, would make house calls to comb through their clients' hair and remove the offending insects. It was a tedious and time-consuming task, but a lucrative one for those with the patience and skill to do it well. Of course, all of these unsanitary conditions created the perfect breeding ground for disease. Without an understanding of germ theory or the importance of hygiene, medieval people were at the mercy of a host of deadly illnesses. Perhaps the most infamous of these was the Black Death, a pandemic of bubonic plague that swept through Europe in the 14th century. The plague was spread by fleas that lived on infected rats. As the rats died off, the fleas sought out new hosts, humans. In the crowded, filthy conditions of medieval cities, the disease spread like wildfire. People fell ill with high fevers, painful swellings called buboes, and blackened skin caused by internal bleeding. Death often came within a matter of days. Imagine the terror of watching a loved one succumb to the plague. The fever takes hold first, leaving them weak and delirious. Then the buboes appear, swelling in the armpits, neck, and groin. The skin turns black and rotten as the body begins to decompose from the inside out. In the final stages, the victim coughs up blood and struggles for breath until death finally claims them. In the face of such a horrific disease, medieval people were desperate for a solution. But without an understanding of how the plague was spread, they often turned to superstition and folk remedies. Some believed that the disease was caused by bad smells or miasmas, and so they carried around pouches of sweet-smelling herbs to ward off the sickness. Doctors, too, bought into the miasma theory. They wore long, beaked masks stuffed with straw and spices, believing that the fragrant herbs would protect them from the deadly vapors. In reality, these masks did little to prevent the spread of the disease, and many doctors fell victim to the very illness they were trying to treat. As the plague raged on, it became clear that medieval society was woefully unprepared to deal with such a catastrophic outbreak. The lack of sanitation and hygiene only exacerbated the problem, allowing the disease to spread unchecked. It wasn't until much later that people began to make the connection between cleanliness and disease prevention. But even in the absence of major outbreaks like the plague, poor hygiene took a toll on medieval people's health. Infections were common, and even minor cuts and scrapes could turn deadly if not properly cleaned and treated. Without antibiotics or sterile medical equipment, surgery was risky business. Many people died from complications like sepsis or gangrene. Personal grooming practices also had their share of health hazards. The heavy, restrictive clothing worn by both men and women could harbor all sorts of unpleasant odors and secretions. Bathing the entire body was rare, so most people made do with a quick wipe down of the visible areas, like the face and hands. In some cases, religious beliefs also played a role in discouraging frequent bathing. Monks and nuns, for example, often saw the neglect of personal hygiene as a sign of piety and devotion. They believed that a dirty, odorous body was a small price to pay for a clean soul. Some monastic orders even had strict rules against bathing more than once or twice a year. But while the religious might have seen filth as a virtue, the reality was that it took a serious toll on their health. Skin infections, parasites, and other ailments were rampant in medieval monasteries and convents. And with close living quarters and shared facilities, diseases could spread quickly through the community. Even among the lay population, there was a certain acceptance of body odor as a normal, even desirable trait. In a society where bathing was rare and perfume was expensive, the natural scent of the human body was not necessarily seen as unpleasant. Some even believed that a person's unique odor could be a sign of their individual essence or character. This idea was taken to extremes by some members of the nobility, who saw the unwashed body as a sign of virility and sexual prowess. King Henry VIII of England, for example, was said to have requested a lady's unwashed undergarments as a token of her affection. The stale, musky scent was apparently quite the aphrodisiac for the king. But while Henry VIII might have found body odour alluring, his own personal hygiene left much to be desired. The king was notoriously overweight and suffered from a variety of ailments, including gout and chronic leg ulcers. His doctors prescribed all manner of treatments, from poultices to bloodletting, but nothing seemed to provide lasting relief. In fact, bloodletting was one of the most common medical practices of the Middle Ages, and one of the most misguided. The idea was that illness was caused by an imbalance of the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. By removing excess blood, doctors believed they could restore balance and promote healing. In reality, bloodletting only served to weaken patients and make them more vulnerable to infection. Many people died from the practice, including some of the most prominent figures of the time. George Washington, for example, was bled repeatedly on his deathbed, likely hastening his demise. It's easy to look back on medieval medical practices with a sense of horror and disbelief, but it's important to remember that people of the time were working with the knowledge and resources available to them. They didn't have the benefit of modern science or sanitation, so they did the best they could with what they had. And to be fair, there were some glimmers of progress in the late Middle Ages. The production of soap became more widespread, making it easier for people to keep themselves and their clothing clean. Public bathhouses began to fall out of favour, replaced by private bathing facilities in the homes of the wealthy. And some cities began to implement rudimentary waste removal systems, though they were still a far cry from modern sewage treatment. But change was slow, and old habits died hard. It would be centuries before the link between hygiene and health was fully understood and embraced. In the meantime, people continued to live with the often nightmarish conditions of medieval life, finding small comforts where they could. As we reflect on the hygienic practices of the Middle Ages, it's easy to feel a sense of superiority and disgust, but it's important to remember that our own modern standards of cleanliness are a relatively recent development in the grand scheme of human history. It's only in the last few centuries that we've come to understand the importance of sanitation and disease prevention. And even then, progress has been uneven. In many parts of the world, access to clean water and proper sanitation is still a luxury, not a given. Diseases like cholera and typhoid, which were once the scourge of medieval Europe, continue to claim lives in developing countries. So while we may look back on the Middle Ages with a sense of horror and fascination, it's important to keep things in perspective. The people of that time were not primitive or backward, but simply working with the knowledge and resources available to them. And in many ways, their struggles and innovations laid the groundwork for the advances that would come in later centuries. In the end, the story of medieval hygiene is one of slow but steady progress, of people doing the best they could in the face of often overwhelming challenges. It's a reminder that change is possible, but it's rarely easy or straightforward. And it's a testament to the resilience and ingenuity of the human spirit, even in the face of the most nightmarish conditions imaginable. As we've seen, the slow march of progress in medieval hygiene was often led by the wealthy and powerful, kings, queens, and nobility, whose own practices, however questionable to our modern sensibilities, gradually trickled down to the masses. One such figure was King Louis XIV of France, also known as the Sun King. Louis reigned for an astonishing 72 years in the 17th and early 18th centuries, and his court at Versailles became the model for royal opulence and etiquette across Europe. But beneath the powdered wigs and perfumed gloves, hygiene at Versailles was far from regal. Louis himself was said to have a particular aversion to bathing. He's thought to have only taken 3 baths in his entire life: at birth, on his wedding day, and on his deathbed. Instead, like many of his contemporaries, Louis relied on heavy perfumes and scented powders to mask his body odour. His favourite scent was orange blossom, which he used so heavily that the fragrance became known as the king's perfume. But Louis's distaste for water didn't stop there. The magnificent palace of Versailles, home to thousands of courtiers, was notorious for its lack of toilet facilities. The opulent Hall of Mirrors, where Louis held court, was often the scene of an unpleasant morning ritual, courtiers relieving themselves behind the curtains or in hidden corners before the day's activities began. Visitors to Versailles often remarked on the overpowering stench that hung in the air, a miasma of unwashed bodies, chamber pots, and horse manure from the palace stables. It's said that when the palace was finally equipped with proper toilets in the late 18th century, it was more to prevent the building's wooden floors from rotting under the constant onslaught of urine than for the comfort of its inhabitants. But while Louis XIV's personal hygiene may have been lacking, he did introduce some innovations in dental care. The Sun King was one of the first to popularize the use of toothpicks at the dining table, a habit he picked up from his Spanish queen, Maria Teresa. Louis had his toothpicks made of gold, silver, or ivory, and kept them in ornate boxes that he handed out as gifts to favored courtiers. Louis also had a personal dentist, a rarity for the time. The king suffered from a number of dental problems throughout his life, including persistent toothaches and abscesses. In an era before anesthesia or modern dental techniques, Louis's dentists had to get creative. One reportedly treated the king's toothache by applying a red-hot iron to his gum, cauterizing the inflamed tissue. Despite these painful treatments, Louis XIV kept most of his teeth until his death at the ripe old age of 76, a remarkable feat for the time. When the king's body was examined during his autopsy, his surgeons noted that he had only lost 3 teeth during his long life, a testament perhaps to the benefits of royal privilege and access to the best dental care the 17th century had to offer. Louis XIV's reign marked a turning point in European history as the medieval era gave way to the Age of Enlightenment. But while the Sun King's court dazzled with its opulence and artistic achievements, its hygiene practices were still mired in the past, reflecting the stubborn persistence of medieval attitudes towards cleanliness and the body. It would take several more centuries, and the tireless efforts of scientists, doctors, and public health advocates to finally bring about the hygienic revolution that transformed the way we live and reduced the burden of disease. But the seeds of that revolution were sown in the medieval era, as people slowly began to question the old ways and seek out new solutions to the age-old problem of keeping clean in a dirty world. As we've journeyed through the grime and grit of medieval life, from the squalor of the streets to the sickly sweet scent of the royal court, one thing has become clear. Hygiene is not just a matter of personal preference or cultural norms, but a vital component of public health and human flourishing. Today, we take for granted the simple act of turning on a tap and having clean, safe water flow forth. We don't think twice about the invisible network of pipes and treatment plants that whisk away our waste and keep our cities clean and livable. And we hardly give a second thought to the daily rituals of brushing our teeth, washing our hands, or taking a shower. But these seemingly mundane acts are the hard-won victories of centuries of struggle against disease, ignorance, and indifference. They are the legacy of the medieval men and women who first began to question the old ways and imagine a world where cleanliness was a right, not a privilege. So the next time you turn on the tap or step into a steaming shower, take a moment to remember the long and winding road that led us here, and give thanks for the tireless efforts of those who came before us, who fought to make the world a cleaner, healthier place for all. Because in the end, the story of hygiene is the story of human progress. A reminder that even in the darkest and dirtiest of times, there is always hope for a brighter, cleaner future. And that's a history lesson worth remembering, even as we drift off to sleep, secure in the knowledge that tomorrow will dawn a little bit cleaner than the day before. The strict hygiene rules of medieval convents may sound surprising, given the general lack of cleanliness at the time. But for the nuns living within these religious communities, maintaining a pure body was seen as essential for preserving a pure soul. The rules varied between different convents and orders, but most required nuns to keep their hair cut short or carefully covered at all times. This was both for modesty and to prevent the spread of lice. Nuns were also expected to wash their faces and hands regularly, although full-body bathing was still infrequent. In some convents, a communal bath would be taken only a few times a year, usually before major religious holidays like Christmas and Easter. The nuns would undress and bathe together in a large wooden tub, with the youngest going first while the water was still relatively clean. By the time the older nuns took their turn, one can imagine the water was quite murky indeed. Despite these occasional baths, nuns still mostly relied on changing their clothes regularly to keep clean. Convents had strict rules around clothing, with nuns often rotating through several identical sets of robes. The discarded robes would be washed thoroughly before being worn again. These clothes were usually made from rough, undyed wool, intentionally plain and scratchy to remind the wearer to focus on spiritual matters over earthly comforts. In the summer heat, one can imagine these heavy robes became quite ripe indeed before wash day came around. But smell was of little concern to most medieval nuns. Pleasant scents were seen as an indulgence, and even the use of harsh lye soaps was discouraged in some stricter communities. The ambition was to be clean enough to be presentable, but not so clean as to be vain. Of course, this didn't mean the nuns were immune to the lice and fleas that plagued medieval society. Close quarters and shared robes meant pests could spread quickly through a convent. Infestations were seen as a test of faith, yet another bodily trial to bear with pious resignation. So the nuns would pick the lice from their hair and robes as best they could, offering up their discomfort as a silent prayer. In a time when disease was rampant and hygiene poorly understood, they placed their trust more in spiritual cleanliness than physical, an approach that was perhaps as much mental self-preservation as religious devotion. The smells and scratching in the convent may have been unpleasant, but they were familiar companions in medieval life. For women who had taken vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, a few fleas were the least of their worries. Their focus was on the cleanliness of their eternal soul, not the cleanliness of their temporary body. But not all medieval religious figures were quite so restrained in their hygiene habits. Consider the notorious King Henry VIII of England. While he was certainly pious in his own way, Henry was not one to deny himself earthly pleasures, and that extended to some rather intimate tokens of affection. It's said that Henry once requested a lady at court send him an unwashed undergarment so that he could savour her scent. In an era before daily bathing, one can only imagine the pungency of this royal love token. But for Henry, a woman's natural aroma was alluring, even erotic. In his youth, the strapping king was considered quite the catch, pursued by noblewomen across Europe. Perhaps a well-ripened bodice was simply the Tudor equivalent of a beguiling perfume. Henry's second wife, Anne Boleyn, supposedly won the king's affections in part through her excellent hygiene and lack of body odour. But as he aged, the king's own hygiene began to deteriorate. Plagued by an ulcerated jousting wound on his leg, Henry's body began to emit a rank odour. Matters weren't helped by his ballooning weight and difficulty bathing properly. In a reversal of his youthful tastes, Henry now demanded his bedchambers be scented with rosewater and herbs to conceal his own stench. The king's foul smell didn't stop him from pursuing new wives and mistresses, though. Even as his reputation for uncleanliness grew, Henry continued to insist that a woman's natural scent was arousing to him. It seems not even a pungent king could fully quell the Tudor libido. From prim nuns to the libertine monarch, individual hygiene practices in the Middle Ages varied as widely as the people themselves. But even royalty was not immune to the general grubbiness of the era. Rich or poor, cleric or king, everyone reeked, and everyone just had to make their peace with it. Of course, all that accumulated filth had consequences beyond the cosmetic. In a time before germ theory, people had little understanding of how poor hygiene helped spread disease. They knew only that pestilence seemed to stalk the land, striking down young and old, rich and poor with brutal efficiency. One of the most notorious and devastating examples was the Black Death, the plague that swept across Europe in the 14th century, wiping out an estimated 30 to 60% of the population. We now know the disease was spread by fleas infected with the bacterium Yersinia pestis. These fleas hitched rides on the rats that scurried through the garbage-strewn streets of medieval towns. But to the people of the time, the plague seemed to come out of nowhere, defying all efforts to stop it. The lack of understanding about contagion meant people often unwittingly hastened the spread. Families tended to their sick loved ones without precautions, while fleas from the dead jumped to the living. The Black Death was no respecter of class or cleanliness. It struck down the haughty and the humble, the fastidious and the filthy. But those living in crowded, unsanitary conditions were particularly vulnerable. In the close quarters of medieval cities, the plague spread like wildfire. Imagine the grisly scene in a plague-stricken household. The first sign might be the egg-sized swellings, or buboes, that gave the bubonic plague its name. These painful lumps would appear in the groin, armpit, or neck, sometimes oozing blood and pus. As the disease progressed, the skin might take on a blackened hue from internal bleeding, hence the moniker Black Death. Fever and chills racked the body, while some victims coughed up blood from the pneumonic form of the plague. Death usually came within a week of the first symptoms. The suffering was immense, but mercifully short-lived. Whole families could be wiped out in a matter of days, their bodies piled in the streets for collection by the cartloads. It's hard to fathom the scale of devastation the plague wrought on medieval society. In some villages, there was scarcely anyone left to bury the dead. Fields went untended, animals starved in their pens, and once bustling market squares fell silent. In the face of such horror, people grasped for any explanation or remedy they could find. Many saw the plague as a divine punishment for sin, scourging themselves in penitential processions. Others turned to quackery and superstition, wearing charms or lighting candles to ward off the pestilence. One enduring image from this time is of the so-called plague doctors, the beaked masks worn by physicians tending to the afflicted. These eerie masks had glass eye holes and a long bird-like beak stuffed with straw, herbs and spices. At the time, foul-smelling miasmas were thought to be a primary spreader of disease. The herbs in the beak were meant to purify the air the doctor breathed and prevent the illness from entering the body. In a twisted way, the belief was not entirely misguided. We now know that coughs and sneezes do indeed spread many illnesses. But the herbs offered little real protection, and many plague doctors fell victim to the disease they sought to treat. Their haunting attire became a symbol of both the desperate ingenuity and woeful medical ignorance of the age. It would be centuries before the true causes of plague and other diseases were understood. In the meantime, the Black Death returned again and again, each time taking a traumatic toll. It's estimated that the population of Europe didn't fully recover until the 1700s. But even in the face of repeated pandemics, medieval hygiene habits were slow to change. The miasma theory persisted well into the 19th century, while basic practices like hand washing and water sanitation took generations to catch on. Old beliefs and habits, it seemed, could be as hard to shake as the fleas themselves. Indeed, some frankly baffling medical notions persisted into surprisingly recent times. Take the practice of bloodletting, the belief that draining a patient's blood could cure all manner of ills. This dubious treatment was enthusiastically embraced in the Middle Ages and remained popular for centuries after. The basic idea was that an imbalance of the four humours, blood, phlegm, black bile and yellow bile, was the root of all disease. Removing excess blood was thought to restore this balance and promote healing. In reality, it only served to weaken already frail patients. Bloodletting was prescribed for everything from headaches to heartburn, gout to gynecological issues. Practitioners used an array of alarming instruments to do the deed: lancets, scarificators, and even leeches. The amounts of blood taken were often substantial, up to several pints in a session. It's hard to overstate just how mainstream this practice was. Everyone from peasants to kings subscribed to the wisdom of bloodletting. Even the esteemed father of our country, George Washington, was not spared the lancet when he fell ill in 1799. The story goes that Washington, then 67, came down with a severe sore throat and fever after riding out in wintry weather. His doctors, as was customary at the time, recommended bloodletting. Over the course of a single day, they drained an estimated 40% of Washington's blood, around 80 ounces. It's a wonder Washington didn't die then and there of hypovolemic shock. But the ailing former president endured the barbaric treatment, only to succumb to his illness 2 days later. One could argue that, in this case, the cure was undoubtedly worse than the disease. Washington's medical team justified the aggressive bloodletting by claiming the blood drawn had been inflamed. But to modern eyes, their actions seem more like desperate guesswork than sound medical practice. In an era before antibiotics, perhaps draining blood felt like one of the few concrete actions a doctor could take. The prevalence of bloodletting, even into the early modern era, underscores just how long it took for hygiene and medicine to advance beyond medieval superstition. Old ideas, like bad smells, had a way of lingering stubbornly, even in the face of mounting evidence to the contrary. But by the late Middle Ages, there were some glimmers of progress, however halting and uneven. As trade routes expanded and cities grew, ideas about hygiene slowly began to evolve. Islamic civilizations, with their emphasis on ritual washing, had a notable influence as cultural exchange increased. Soap making, which had declined after the fall of Rome, began to rebound in the 12th and 13th centuries. Recipes using ash and animal fat became more sophisticated, with the wealthy able to afford castile, soaps perfumed with olive oil. Public bathhouses, long feared as dens of sin and sickness, gradually regained popularity. In 1326, the medical faculty of Paris declared that steam baths could be beneficial for health, giving this pastime renewed legitimacy. And as the horrors of the Black Death receded, some cities began to take proactive steps to improve sanitation. In 1388, the English Parliament banned the dumping of animal entrails and other waste into waterways, though enforcement was another matter. Progress was piecemeal and slow, but the seeds of change were gradually taking root. By the dawn of the Renaissance, medieval filth and fatalism were beginning to give way to a new, if still imperfect, standard of cleanliness. Looking back from our modern vantage point, it can be hard to imagine living in a world where fleas were fashion accessories and doctors' masks were more ominous than the diseases they sought to treat. We wrinkle our noses at the thought of once-yearly baths and chamber pots dumped from windows. But it's important to remember that medieval people were doing the best they could with the knowledge and resources available to them. They may have been marinating in their own filth, but they were also building soaring cathedrals, crafting masterful works of art, and laying the foundations for the modern world. In a time when life expectancy hovered around 30 years and childbirth was a perilous gamble, perhaps a little grime and body odor were the least of one's worries. What mattered was living each day as fully as possible in service to God and community. And even in the darkest, dirtiest depths of the Middle Ages, there were those who dared to imagine a brighter, cleaner future. The nuns who insisted on clean faces and hands, the doctors who stuffed their masks with herbs, the monarchs who washed more than twice in their lives, all were groping towards a better way, however imperfectly. Their hard-won lessons laid the groundwork for the hygiene advances that would follow. The rise of germ theory, the advent of modern plumbing, the life-saving magic of antibiotics and vaccines. We may recoil at medieval filthiness, but we also stand on the shoulders of our grimy ancestors. So the next time you take a hot shower, brush your teeth, or wash your hands before a meal, spare a thought for the medieval masses who came before. They may have been dirty, diseased, and despairing, but they were also resilient, resourceful, and relentlessly human, just like us. Their struggles paved the way for our sanitized modern world, and their stories, however unsavory, are an essential part of our shared history. By understanding how far we've come, we can better appreciate the luxuries we often take for granted, and continue to work towards a future where good health and hygiene are accessible to all. So let us bid goodnight to the medieval nuns in their scratchy robes, the plague doctors in their beaked masks, and the lovelorn kings sniffing soiled undergarments. They may not have been paragons of cleanliness, but they were doing their best with the knowledge and means available. As you drift off to sleep in your soft, clean bed, take comfort in how far hygiene has come, and how much further it still has to go. The story of human cleanliness is one of progress, setbacks, and enduring hope. A reminder that even the most intractable problems can be solved with time, effort, and a dash of ingenuity. Sweet dreams, and don't let the bed bugs bite. Our journey through the malodorous Middle Ages now brings us to the topic of oral hygiene, or rather, the appalling lack thereof. If you thought the medieval streets reeked, imagine the state of the average mouth. Rotting teeth and foul breath were simply a fact of life, as ubiquitous as chamber pots and lice-ridden heads. Dental care was rudimentary at best. Most people simply rubbed their teeth with a cloth, sometimes using abrasives like salt, chalk, or ground shells in an attempt to scrub away the buildup. Twigs or sticks were chewed until they frayed into bristles to pick at the stubborn bits lodged between teeth. But these half-hearted measures did little to combat the decay that inevitably set in. Even royalty were not immune to the ravages of poor oral hygiene. Take, for instance, the famously vain Queen Elizabeth I of England. Despite her legendary beauty, her teeth were said to be blackened and rotten, her breath so foul that courtiers strained to keep a straight face in her presence. It's rumoured that Her Majesty's sweet tooth was to blame. She allegedly consumed vast quantities of sugar, a rare and expensive luxury at the time. Combined with her aversion to cleaning her teeth, it proved a recipe for dental disaster. But Queen Elizabeth was hardly unique in this regard. Across the medieval world, teeth rotted away in the heads of peasants and kings alike. The wealthier classes could afford slightly more sophisticated methods like tooth powders made from burnt herbs or crushed bone. But even these were a far cry from the minty fresh concoctions we rely on today. Interestingly, some of the most advanced dental practices of the era came courtesy of an unlikely source: the much maligned barber surgeon. These jacks of all trades were responsible for everything from cutting hair to amputating limbs, and dentistry fell somewhere in between. Armed with pliers, picks, and a shocking lack of anesthesia, barber surgeons were the go-to for tooth extractions. It was a crude and painful business, but preferable to letting a rotten tooth fester in your jawbone. As the Middle Ages progressed, so too did the range of dental accoutrements available. Toothpicks, once the preserve of the rich, became more widely used. Usually crafted from bone, wood, or ivory, these slender sticks were used to dislodge stubborn food particles, and were even thought to sweeten the breath. In some circles, the ability to wield a toothpick with nonchalant grace was seen as the height of refined manners. But for most ordinary folk, oral hygiene remained an afterthought at best. With so many other pressing concerns, like avoiding the plague or eking out a meagre living, the state of one's teeth was low on the priority list. And so the people of the Middle Ages went about their lives, their mouths a breeding ground for all manner of unpleasantness. It's a far cry from the gleaming smiles and minty fresh breath we take for granted today. But as we've seen time and again in our journey through medieval hygiene, practices that seem unthinkable to us now were simply a normal part of life for our ancestors. They made do with the knowledge and resources available to them, blissfully unaware of the billions that would one day be spent on electric toothbrushes and whitening strips. So the next time you grudgingly drag yourself to the sink to brush your teeth before bed, spare a thought for your medieval counterparts. They may have been content to let their teeth rot away in their heads, but they also never had to sit through a dental insurance sales pitch. In that respect, at least, perhaps the joke is on us. And so we bid farewell to the grim world of medieval oral hygiene and turn our attention to another scourge of the era, the humble louse. These tiny terrors made the rotting teeth seem positively pleasant by comparison. From the lowliest peasant to the grandest monarch, no head was safe from their incessant crawling and nibbling. As we've seen, the typical medieval peasant had to navigate a minefield of filth and foul odours just to go about their daily life in the crowded, unsanitary cities. But even for those of higher status, regular bathing was far from a common practice. While public bathhouses did exist in medieval Europe, they were more often seen as social gathering places than a means of getting thoroughly clean. Men and women would mingle freely in these steamy, dimly lit spaces, and the same murky water would be used by countless patrons before being changed. It was not unusual for meals and alcoholic beverages to be served right there in the baths, adding to the convivial, but not exactly hygienic, atmosphere. One can imagine the shock of a noble couple, accustomed to their own private quarters, upon entering one of these rowdy public baths for the first time. The air would be thick with steam and the musky scent of bodies, the sounds of splashing and raucous laughter echoing off the stone walls. They would gingerly step into the cloudy, tepid water, acutely aware of the press of naked strangers on all sides. Modesty had little place here. The couple might exchange uneasy glances as they watched their fellow bathers engaged in all manner of unseemly activities. Gossiping, gambling, even enjoying intimate embraces in shadowy alcoves. The line between washing and debauchery seemed perilously thin. As servants passed around goblets of wine and trays of sweetmeats, the noble pair would soon be swept up in the strange blend of sensual indulgence and perfunctory cleansing that characterized these medieval baths. But even this irregular, half-hearted attempt at washing would be viewed with suspicion by many. There was a widespread belief in the Middle Ages that bathing, especially in hot water, could actually let disease enter the body through the pores of the skin. This idea originated with the ancient Greek physician Galen, who cautioned that warm baths opened the body's pores and made it vulnerable to infection. Medieval doctors took this warning to heart, often advising their patients to avoid bathing altogether, especially if they were already ill. One famous example of this aversion to bathing was Queen Isabella I of Castile, the Spanish monarch best known for sponsoring the voyages of Christopher Columbus. By all accounts, Isabella had a notorious disregard for personal hygiene, even by the standards of her time. Some sources claim that she only bathed twice in her entire life, once at birth and once on the eve of her wedding day. Whether this is strictly true or a bit of historical exaggeration, there's no doubt that Queen Isabella was comfortable with a level of grime that would appall most modern sensibilities. Her servants were said to remove the lice from her shirts so they could be washed and sewn back in for flavour. The Queen apparently believed that bathing would damage her health, robbing her skin of its natural oils and making her vulnerable to disease. Of course, Isabella's famously malodorous presence didn't prevent her from being a formidable ruler. She united the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon, completing the Reconquista that drove the Moors from Spain. She also laid the groundwork for the Spanish Inquisition and sponsored Columbus's journey that would open the way for the Spanish colonization of the Americas. Still, one has to wonder how her royal court must have smelled. with the queen and her retinue all marinating in their own funk. The heavy perfumes and scented powders that were liberally applied by men and women alike could only do so much to mask the pervasive stench of unwashed bodies. Indeed, dousing oneself in fragrance was perhaps the most common way of dealing with body odor in the Middle Ages. The wealthy would carry pomanders, small perforated containers filled with aromatic herbs and spices, to sniff when the stench of the unwashed masses became overwhelming. Rosewater was also popular for washing the hands and face, as it was believed to have purifying properties. But all the perfumes of Arabia couldn't sweeten the squalor of medieval oral hygiene. Dental care was rudimentary at best, with most people simply rubbing their teeth with a cloth, sometimes dipped in salt or other abrasives like chalk or ground eggshells. Toothbrushes as we know them didn't appear until much later, and toothpaste was a distant dream. As a result, rotting teeth and foul breath were the norm, even among the highest echelons of society. Queen Elizabeth I of England, for all her power and glamour, was said to have such decayed and blackened teeth that she had difficulty speaking and eating. Her fondness for sweets, combined with the lead-based white makeup she used to achieve her signature pale complexion, had ravaged her once pearly whites. Foreign ambassadors would recoil at the stench of Elizabeth's breath during audiences, and her ladies-in-waiting had to discreetly pass her sachets of perfume to hold against her nose and mask the smell. The Queen's vanity made her reluctant to have her ruined teeth pulled, leaving her in constant pain from tooth abscesses. It's a far cry from the gleaming smiles we associate with royalty today. But Elizabeth was hardly alone in her dental woes. Many medieval people simply accepted tooth loss as a natural part of aging, and gaps in one's smile were not considered a social liability as they are now. There were a few small advances in oral hygiene during the Middle Ages. Toothpicks, made from quills, metals, or even wood splinters, became a common sight at the tables of the affluent. And some medieval recipes for tooth cleaning powders have been found, containing ingredients like herbs, spices, and burnt hartshorn, powdered deer antler. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of medieval dentistry was the emergence of the barber surgeon. These jack-of-all-trades professionals not only cut hair and trimmed beards, but also performed a variety of surgical procedures, including tooth extractions. One can imagine a desperate soul, driven to the brink by an agonizing toothache, gingerly settling into the barber surgeon's chair. The room would be lit by flickering candles, the air heavy with the coppery scent of blood and the sharp tang of medicinal herbs. An array of gleaming blades and cruel-looking implements would be laid out on the table, making the patient's heart race with dread. The barber surgeon, a man of grim mien and steady hands, would select his tool, perhaps a pair of rudimentary forceps or a slender hooked pick. With a muttered prayer and a swift, practiced motion, he would grasp the offending tooth and wrench it free, the patient's scream echoing off the close walls. Blood would gush forth, quickly stanched with a wad of cloth or a hot iron. It was a brutal, agonizing process, but for many, it was the only hope of relief from the torment of a rotting tooth. And the barber surgeons, for all their lack of formal training, were often surprisingly adept at their grisly trade. Some even pioneered techniques like filling cavities with beeswax or other materials, though these were rare. Still, most people simply suffered through the pain, their mouths an ongoing battleground of decay and infection. And if the state of medieval teeth was dire, the condition of the average person's hair and scalp was hardly better. Lice were a ubiquitous scourge, infesting the unwashed locks of rich and poor alike. These persistent pests would cause an incessant itching, leading sufferers to scratch their heads raw. But getting rid of them was an uphill battle in a time when hair washing was a rare and haphazard affair. Even the nobility were not immune to the plague of lice. King Louis XIII of France, who reigned in the early 17th century, was known to have a severe infestation, likely exacerbated by the voluminous wigs he wore to conceal his thinning hair. His wife, Queen Anne of Austria, famously quipped that the king's wig, lousy with vermin. Louis was so tormented by his itchy scalp that he had a special silver comb made, designed to part his hair every half-inch, so that the lice could be meticulously picked out. His valet would spend hours each day on this tedious task, filling cups with the squirming insects plucked from the royal head. The king's lice-ridden wig became a subject of morbid fascination at court, with courtiers placing bets on how many pests could be combed out in a single sitting. It was said that the wig was so heavily infested that it practically moved of its own accord, a seething mass of vermin nesting in the powdered curls. For the common folk, wigs were an unattainable luxury, but they had their own methods of dealing with lice, albeit less refined. Combs made from bone, wood, or ivory have been found in many medieval archaeological sites, testifying to the ongoing battle against head lice. Some people resorted to shaving their heads entirely, a practice more common among men than women. Others would coat their hair in pungent substances like vinegar, beer, or even urine in an attempt to drown or disgust the lice into abandoning ship. These home remedies met with varying degrees of success. But perhaps the most intriguing and disturbing approach to lice control was the use of louse traps. These were small, perforated boxes or tubes that would be filled with bits of cloth, fur, or even rotting meat and tied into the hair. The idea was that the lice would be drawn to the warmth and odor of the trap, crawling inside and becoming ensnared. These traps would be left in place for days or even weeks, the lice multiplying within until the containers were teeming with the blood-sucking pests. It was a grim calculus. Better to concentrate the infestation in a contained area than to have them roaming free across the scalp. When the traps were finally removed, they would be cracked open and the contents dumped into the fire, the noxious smell of burning lice filling the air. It was a temporary reprieve at best, as a few hardy survivors always managed to escape and recolonize the hair. The cycle of infestation and eradication would begin anew. In some cases, professional lice pickers would be employed to manually remove the vermin, a painstaking and time-consuming task. These nitpickers, often women, would advertise their services in the marketplace, offering to rid clients of their unwanted guests for a fee. One can picture a medieval nitpicker at work, her client seated on a low stool in the sunlight. The picker would part the hair with a fine-toothed comb, her keen eyes scanning for the telltale glint of a louse scuttling along the scalp. With deft fingers, she would pluck out the insect and crush it between her nails, the tiny pop audible in the still air. It was a lucrative trade, if not a glamorous one. A skilled nitpicker could command a steady clientele, becoming a fixture in the town square or making house calls to regular customers. Some even claimed to have proprietary techniques or secret formulas for banishing lice, though the efficacy of these was dubious at best. Still, in a world where head lice were as much a part of daily life as fleas on a dog, the nitpickers provided a measure of relief and comfort. Their services may have been humble, but they were no less essential for it. The prevalence of lice and other vermin was just one symptom of the larger problem of poor hygiene in the Middle Ages. With little understanding of how diseases spread and few effective means of preventing or treating them, medieval people were at the mercy of a host of deadly ailments. Perhaps the most notorious of these was the bubonic plague, also known as the Black Death. This devastating pandemic swept through Europe in the 14th century, wiping out an estimated 30 to 60% of the population. It was a terrifying and gruesome way to die, with victims succumbing to high fevers, agonizing pain, and the grotesque swelling of the lymph nodes into buboes. The plague was spread by fleas that lived on rats, which thrived in the filthy conditions of medieval cities. With open sewers, rotting garbage, and overcrowded living quarters, these urban centres were perfect breeding grounds for disease. A typical plague victim might start showing symptoms within a few days of being bitten by an infected flea. They would be seized by a sudden fever and chills, their head pounding and their limbs heavy with fatigue. As the disease progressed, agonizing buboes would appear in the armpits, neck and groin, swelling to the size of eggs or even apples. The pain was excruciating, described as feeling like being burned with hot coals. The buboes would turn black and putrid, sometimes rupturing and oozing foul-smelling pus. Victims would cough up blood as their lungs filled with fluid, their breath coming in short, agonized gasps. Most succumbed within a week of falling ill, their bodies racked by sepsis and organ failure. It was a horrific and lonely death, as the highly contagious nature of the plague meant that victims were often shunned and abandoned by their loved ones. In the absence of any effective treatment, people resorted to all manner of desperate measures to ward off the plague. Some wore talismans or amulets inscribed with holy words or symbols, believing that these would protect them from the disease. Others burned aromatic herbs and spices, hoping that the fragrant smoke would purify the air and drive away the sickness. One of the most iconic images of the plague era is that of the plague doctor, with his long black robe, wide-brimmed hat, and eerie beaked mask. These masks were designed to be filled with sweet-smelling herbs and straw, which were believed to filter out the dangerous miasmas or bad air that were thought to carry the disease. In reality, these measures did little to prevent the spread of the plague, which was primarily transmitted by fleas rather than airborne particles. But they reflect the prevailing belief of the time that diseases were caused by noxious smells and imbalances in the body's humours. This miasma theory would persist for centuries, even as evidence began to mount that contagion was spread through contact with infected individuals or contaminated objects. It wasn't until the late 19th century that the germ theory of disease would finally take hold, thanks to the work of scientists like Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch. In the meantime, the lack of understanding about hygiene and sanitation continued to take a heavy toll on medieval populations. Even when the worst of the plague had passed, other diseases like smallpox, tuberculosis, and dysentery remained rampant, fueled by the unsanitary conditions and close quarters of medieval life. Childbirth was an especially perilous time for women, with many succumbing to childbed fever caused by bacterial infections. Without an understanding of antisepsis or sterilization, midwives and doctors would often introduce harmful microbes into the birthing chamber on their unwashed hands and instruments. In the face of such constant threats to health and life, it's perhaps no wonder that medieval people clung to superstition and folk remedies. The idea that illness was a punishment from God or the result of witchcraft was widespread, leading to the persecution of supposed heretics and the mentally ill. At the same time, the Church played a significant role in providing what passed for medical care in the Middle Ages. Monasteries and convents often served as de facto hospitals, with monks and nuns tending to the sick and infirm as part of their religious duties. These institutions had their own strict codes of hygiene, though by modern standards they would still be considered woefully inadequate. Monks were required to wash their hands before meals and after using the latrines, and to keep their habits and bedding reasonably clean. But the water used for washing was often shared and infrequently changed, and the concept of sterilizing medical instruments was still centuries away. Still, for the medieval sick and suffering, the care provided by religious orders was often the only option available. Monasteries would take in lepers, plague victims, and others shunned by society, offering them what comfort and treatment they could. It's a poignant image. The gentle nuns in their habits, moving quietly among the rows of straw pallets where the sick lie moaning and writhing. The air would be thick with the stench of disease and the cloying sweetness of burning incense. The flickering candlelight, casting eerie shadows on the stone walls. The sisters would offer sips of water and murmured prayers, their cool hands soothing fevered brows. They would change soiled bedding and empty chamber pots, risking their own health to tend to the most wretched and forsaken of society's cast-offs. It was a humble kind of heroism, born of a deep sense of religious duty and compassion. And while the treatments they offered were often little more than palliative, the simple act of caring for the sick and dying was a powerful thing in a world where so many suffered alone. Outside the monastery walls, the realities of medieval life meant that most people had little choice but to accept a certain level of filth and discomfort as a fact of life. Heavy, multi-layered clothing was the norm, serving to conceal sweat and grime as well as to provide warmth in the often drafty buildings. Bathing the entire body was a rare luxury, and even the nobility might go weeks or months without a full immersion. Instead, people made do with washing the hands, face, and sometimes the feet, using basins of water and rough cloths. The very wealthy might have servants to assist with these ablutions. Let us turn our attention now to the realm of medieval oral hygiene, a phrase that may strike the modern ear as somewhat oxymoronic. After all, what need had the medieval person for minty fresh breath or a dazzling smile? Life was brutish and short, and there were certainly more pressing concerns than the state of one's teeth and gums. But even in the Dark Ages, there were some who gave thought to the care and keeping of the mouth. Rudimentary toothbrushes, such as they were, began to make an appearance. These were often little more than sticks or twigs, frayed at one end to create a sort of makeshift bristle. The more affluent might have a brush with bristles of hog or horsehair, but let us not kid ourselves. These were a far cry from the electric spin brushes and smartphone-enabled toothbrushes of today. No, for the most part, dental hygiene consisted of rubbing the teeth with a cloth, perhaps with a bit of salt or chalk for abrasion. Ground shells or bone were also used, in an attempt to scrape away the buildup of plaque and debris. It was a valiant effort, but one that was doomed to fall short. For you see, the medieval diet was not exactly conducive to oral health. Bread, ale, and meat were the staples, with precious little in the way of fresh fruits or vegetables. And the bread of the time was a far cry from the soft, fluffy loaves we know today. No, this was a tough, gritty bread, full of bits of stone and grit from the millstones used to grind the grain. With every bite, the teeth were subjected to a veritable sandblasting. And so it was that by the time they reached adulthood, most medieval folk had a mouthful of rotting, blackened stumps. Foul breath was the norm, and tooth loss was expected, if not embraced. It was seen as a natural part of the aging process, like the greying of hair or the wrinkling of skin. But there were some who rose above the norm, whose oral hygiene was the stuff of legend. Take, for example, Queen Elizabeth I of England. Now, Liz was known for many things: her fiery red hair, her sharp wit, her skill at politics and intrigue. But she was also known for her truly appalling breath. It was said that Her Majesty's mouth was a veritable cesspool, a fetid swamp of decay and putrescence. Her teeth were blackened and rotting, her gums swollen and oozing. And the smell. Oh, the smell. It was enough to make a strong man swoon. But did Queen Bess let a little thing like rank halitosis hold her back? Not on your life. She simply ordered her courtiers to stand a little further back and carried on ruling with an iron fist. She even turned her foul breath into a sort of weapon, using it to intimidate and unnerve her enemies. Talk about making lemonade out of lemons. But even the mighty Queen Elizabeth could not escape the ravages of tooth decay forever. In her later years, she was forced to have several teeth pulled, leaving her with sunken cheeks and a rather unfortunate lisp. But still she persevered, never letting a little thing like missing teeth stop her from delivering a cutting remark or a withering put-down. And so, as we drift off to sleep, let us spare a thought for the brave men and women of medieval times who faced the horrors of oral hygiene with stoicism and grace. They may not have had the gleaming white smiles of Hollywood starlets, but they had something far more valuable: the grit and determination to carry on, even in the face of rampant tooth decay. And that, my friends, is something to admire. But the story of medieval oral hygiene is not all gloom and doom. No, there were some surprising bright spots, some glimmers of hope amidst the sea of rotting teeth and putrid breath. One such bright spot was the emergence of the barber surgeon. Now, I know what you're thinking. What on earth does a barber have to do with dentistry? But in medieval times, the lines between professions were often blurred, and the barber surgeon was a jack of all trades when it came to matters of health and hygiene. These intrepid individuals were not only responsible for cutting hair and trimming beards, but also for performing a wide range of medical procedures, including bloodletting, wound treatment, and, you guessed it, dentistry. Now, before you start picturing a burly, bearded man wielding a pair of rusty pliers, let me assure you that the dental practices of the barber surgeon were actually quite advanced for their time. They had a range of specialized tools at their disposal, including dental forceps for extracting teeth, and small chisels and files for shaping and smoothing the remaining stumps. But perhaps their most impressive tool was the dental pelican. No, not the large-billed aquatic bird, although that would certainly make for an interesting dental visit. No, the dental pelican was a kind of forceps, named for its resemblance to a pelican's beak. It was used to grasp and extract teeth and was considered a marvel of medieval engineering. But the barber surgeon's expertise didn't stop at tooth extraction. They were also skilled in the art of tooth restoration, using a variety of materials to fill cavities and replace missing teeth. Gold and silver were popular choices for the wealthy, while the less affluent might have to make do with lead or even wood. And for those who had lost all their teeth, the barber surgeon could even craft a set of dentures using materials like ivory, bone, or even human teeth. Yes, you heard that right, human teeth. It was not uncommon for the teeth of the dead to be harvested and repurposed for the living. Waste not, want not, as they say. But lest you think the barber surgeon was some kind of medieval miracle worker, let me remind you that their success rate was, shall we say, variable. Infections were common, and the pain of dental procedures was often excruciating. And let's not forget the risk of transmitting diseases like syphilis or tuberculosis through unsterilized equipment. Still, the barber surgeon was a vital part of medieval society, providing a much-needed service in a time when dental hygiene was sorely lacking. And who knows, perhaps their legacy lives on in the modern-day dentist, with their fancy chairs and high-tech tools. Although I think we can all agree that the human tooth dentures are best left in the past. As we continue our journey through the annals of medieval hygiene, we come now to a topic that may make even the sturdiest among us squirm: the issue of hair and lice. Yes, my friends, it's time to talk about the creepy crawlies that called the medieval scalp home. Now, it's important to remember that in medieval times, washing one's hair was not exactly a top priority. In fact, it was often seen as downright unhealthy. The prevailing belief was that washing the hair too frequently could strip away the natural oils that protected against disease and infection, and so many people simply let their hair grow wild and free, rarely if ever subjecting it to the indignity of a good scrubbing. As you can imagine, this laissez-faire approach to hair care had some rather unpleasant consequences. Lice were a constant companion, merrily setting up shop in the tangled manes of men and women alike. And these were not the cute, cuddly kind of lice. No, these were the big, juicy, blood-sucking kind, the kind that could drive a person to distraction with their constant itching and crawling. But fear not, dear listener. The medieval mind was not entirely defenseless against these tiny terrors. The lice comb was a popular tool, crafted from materials like bone, wood, or ivory. These combs had teeth that were closely spaced, allowing them to capture and remove even the wiliest of lice. But the lice comb was not the only weapon in the medieval arsenal. Some people swore by the power of mercury, rubbing it into the scalp in an attempt to poison the little buggers. Others tried more natural remedies, like rubbing the hair with a mixture of vinegar and pepper, or even setting the little creatures on fire. Yes, you read that right. Setting them on fire. I can only imagine the smell. But perhaps the most famous example of medieval hair hygiene, or lack thereof, can be found in the story of King Louis XIII of France. Now, Louis was known for many things: his love of the arts, his patronage of the great thinkers of his time, and his truly spectacular wigs. But beneath those towering piles of curls and waves lay a dark secret. The royal scalp was positively crawling with lice. It was said that the king's head was so infested that the lice could be seen dropping from his wig onto his collar, like some kind of grotesque dandruff. But did King Louis let a little thing like a head full of blood-sucking parasites bother him? Not in the slightest. He simply had his servants pick them out one by one, a task that could take hours each day. And when the lice became too numerous to control, he simply had his wig maker craft him a new one, leaving the old one to be burned in a kind of lice-infested effigy. Now, before we judge King Louis too harshly, let us remember that he was not alone in his lice-ridden plight. Lice were a fact of life for rich and poor alike in medieval times, and dealing with them was simply a part of the daily routine. In fact, lice picking was a legitimate profession, with skilled practitioners plying their trade in the streets and marketplaces. These intrepid souls would set up shop with a stool and a fine-toothed comb, ready to rid the world of lice, one head at a time. It may not have been the most glamorous of jobs, but it was an honest day's work, and a vital service in a time when personal hygiene was a rare luxury. So the next time you find yourself feeling a bit itchy, spare a thought for your medieval ancestors, who battled the scourge of lice with nothing more than a comb and a prayer. And be grateful for the modern marvels of lice shampoo and net combs. Trust me, they're worth their weight in gold. As we've seen, the slow progress in medieval hygiene was not due to a lack of effort or ingenuity, but rather the limited knowledge of the time. People were doing the best they could with the information and resources available. They knew something was amiss, what with all the disease and stench, but they were grasping in the dark for solutions. Take the example of the medieval doctor, clad in his iconic beaked mask. To us, it looks quite ridiculous, this ominous figure, looking like some sort of monstrous bird, poking and prodding at the sick and dying. But to the medieval mind, this was the cutting edge of disease prevention. The long beak of the mask would be stuffed full of aromatic herbs and straw, thought to filter out the bad air and protect the doctor from the deadly miasma. These doctors would make their rounds, moving from town to town, their arrival often greeted with a mix of hope and dread. They were the last resort for many desperate souls ravaged by the Black Death or other ailments. With their limited understanding, they would prescribe bloodletting, leeches, or potions made from exotic spices and mysterious powders. More often than not, their cures would be worse than the disease itself. One of the most famous cases of medical misadventure was that of George Washington, the first president of the United States. In his final hours, ravaged by a throat infection, Washington's doctors decided that an extensive bloodletting was in order. They drained an estimated 40% of his blood over the course of a few hours, hoping to cure him of the bad humours. Alas, this medieval practice did more harm than good, and Washington soon succumbed. Even at the dawn of the 19th century, old habits died hard. But amidst all the missteps and misconceptions, there were glimmers of progress in the late Middle Ages. The production of soap, which had been around since ancient times, began to increase. more and more people were realizing the benefits of regular bathing. Public bathhouses, though still more social venues than hygienic ones, were becoming increasingly common in cities across Europe. Waste removal was also seeing some advancements. While the sight and smell of open sewers would remain a fixture of many medieval towns, some forward-thinking cities began to construct underground sewage systems. These were a far cry from modern standards, but they were a step in the right direction. In London, for example, the aptly named Great Drain was constructed in the 14th century to carry waste away from the city centre. It was a start. Perhaps one of the most significant developments in medieval hygiene was the increasing use of whitewashing. This was the practice of coating the interior walls of a building with a mixture of lime and water. While primarily used for aesthetic purposes, to give buildings a clean, bright appearance, it also had the unintended benefit of being a disinfectant. The lime in the whitewash would help to kill off bacteria and discourage the growth of mold and mildew. Castles and cathedrals across Europe began to gleam with this pristine white coating, a stark contrast to the grime and squalor that often surrounded them. It was a small victory for cleanliness in a world that was often anything but. Inside these whitewashed walls, the upper echelons of medieval society could maintain a semblance of hygiene, even as the common folk continued to toil in filth. But even in the grandest castles and the most pious monasteries, the spectre of poor hygiene was never far away. The rigid social hierarchy of the Middle Ages meant that personal cleanliness was often seen as the purview of the lower classes. Servants and chambermaids were tasked with emptying chamber pots, laundering clothes, and keeping their noble masters and mistresses presentable. Within the great halls of Europe's castles, the gentry would dine on the sumptuous feasts, gorging themselves on rich meats, savoury pies, and endless goblets of wine. But amidst all this finery, there was a distinct lack of table manners. Belching, spitting, and even vomiting were all common sights at a medieval banquet. Scraps of food would be tossed onto the rushes strewn across the floor, there to rot and fester until the next big clean. And those rushes, they were a hygiene nightmare in their own right. Rushes, a type of grass-like plant, would be scattered across the stone floors of castles and manor houses in an attempt to provide some warmth and comfort underfoot. But they would quickly become saturated with spilled food, drink, and all manner of bodily fluids. Servants would simply add new layers of rushes on top of the old, leading to a foul-smelling, bug-infested mat that would be left to fester for months on end. It's no wonder then that even the nobility were not immune to the health problems caused by poor hygiene. Dental issues were rampant, with toothache and tooth loss a common complaint. Skin infections and parasites were also a constant bother, with lice and fleas an ever-present companions. Even royalty was not spared the indignities of medieval hygiene. Take King Henry VIII of England, for example. This larger-than-life figure, known for his voracious appetites and his 6 wives, was a notorious slob. His eating habits were the stuff of legend, with contemporary accounts describing him tearing into joints of meat with his hands and teeth, grease and juices running down his chin, and staining his elaborate robes. But it was Henry's romantic pursuits that truly highlight the hygienic standards, or lack thereof, of the time. In one infamous incident, Henry reportedly requested that a prospective mistress send him one of her unwashed undergarments, so that he could savour her scent. To the modern nose, this would be an unthinkable act of grossness. But to Henry and his contemporaries, the natural odours of the body were not just tolerated, but often celebrated as alluring and erotic. This was a time when bathing was infrequent at best, and the idea of daily changes of underwear was virtually unheard of. The same chemise or codpiece might be worn for weeks or even months on end, absorbing all the sweat, grime, and other bodily emanations. The result was a pungent cocktail of odours that would assault the senses of any modern time traveller. But for the people of the Middle Ages, this was simply a fact of life. the stench of unwashed bodies, the itch of lice and fleas, the ache of rotting teeth. These were all just part of the daily struggle for survival in a world that was often harsh, unsanitary, and disease-ridden. It's easy for us to look back and judge, to wrinkle our noses at the thought of sleeping in vermin-infested sheets or drinking from a chamber pot. But we have the benefit of hindsight, of centuries of scientific progress and cultural evolution. For the people of the Middle Ages, hygiene was not a matter of negligence or ignorance, but rather a reflection of the limitations of their time and place. They did the best they could with what they had, improvising solutions and gradually improving their lot as new knowledge and resources became available. From the whitewashed walls of the wealthy to the pungent herb sachets of the plague doctor, medieval hygiene was a patchwork of practices, some effective, some misguided, but all a testament to human resilience and ingenuity in the face of adversity. So the next time you take a hot shower, brush your teeth with minty toothpaste, or slip into a pair of clean, crisp sheets, take a moment to appreciate these small luxuries. They are the product of centuries of trial and error, of countless generations struggling and striving for a better, cleaner way of life. Medieval hygiene may have been a nightmare by our standards, but it was also a necessary step on the long journey towards the hygienic comforts we enjoy today. So let us not judge too harshly the people of the past, but rather marvel at how far we've come and how much farther we still have to go. For the story of human hygiene is not a straight line, but a winding path, full of detours and dead ends, but ultimately leading towards a brighter, cleaner future for all. And with that, we come to the end of our journey through the muck and mire of medieval hygiene. It's been a wild ride, full of fascinating tales and cringe-worthy details. But I hope it's also given you a new appreciation for the simple, everyday acts of cleanliness that we so often take for granted. So as you drift off to sleep, safe in the knowledge that you won't be waking up to a bed full of bugs or a chamber pot in need of emptying, spare a thought for your medieval ancestors. They may have been a bit smelly and a bit strange by our standards, but they were also brave, resourceful, and utterly human. Just like us, they were doing the best they could with what they had. And in that, we are all connected, across the centuries and the miles, in this grand, messy, beautiful thing we call life. Good night, and sweet dreams. May your sleep be as clean and comfortable as a freshly whitewashed castle wall. We've been conditioned to think of the Middle Ages as a time of squalor, disease, and general uncleanliness. And while there's certainly truth to that notion, the full story of medieval hygiene is a bit more nuanced. Like a peasant navigating a muck-filled street, we must tread carefully through the waste-strewn alleys of history, stepping over the chamber pots and animal droppings to uncover how people of the time really lived and smelled. You see, in an age before microscopes and germ theory, people had a very different understanding of cleanliness. They didn't connect poor hygiene with illness the way we do today. In fact, many believed that layers of dirt could actually protect the skin, and that bathing too often might let disease enter the body. So most folk, even the wealthy, simply didn't wash themselves or their clothes very frequently. But as unpleasant as that may sound to our modern sensibilities, medieval people weren't just happily wallowing in filth. They developed all sorts of creative ways to mask odors and keep up appearances. And slowly, over the centuries, new ideas and inventions emerged that would pave the way for the hygiene standards we enjoy today. So, come, let us embark on an olfactory adventure through the muck and mire of the Middle Ages. We'll meet some malodorous monarchs, sniff out some surprising hygiene habits, and discover how our medieval ancestors coped with the not-so-sweet smell of everyday life. It's a journey that may make you wrinkle your nose, but I promise, you'll come away with a new appreciation for the humble bar of soap. And if the stench of history starts to feel a bit too real, fear not. You're safely tucked into your clean, cozy bed. Perhaps the foul smells of the past will make you all the more grateful for your freshly laundered sheets. So breathe easy and let the lull of this rather odorous bedtime story carry you off to sweeter smelling dreams. Our first stop on this dubious tour of medieval cleanliness is perhaps the most fundamental: water and waste. Today, we take for granted the miracle of modern plumbing. With the turn of a tap, clean water flows freely, and with a simple flush, our waste is whisked away, out of sight and out of mind. But for our medieval ancestors, it was a very different story. Picture yourself as a common peasant, stepping out your front door onto the narrow, winding street of a 14th century town. The first thing that hits you is the smell, a potent mix of rotting food scraps, animal dung, and human excrement. You see, without proper sewage systems, people simply tossed their waste out into the open, letting it accumulate in stinking piles and puddles. As you begin to navigate this foul-smelling obstacle course, you hear a shout from above. You look up just in time to see a chamber pot being emptied from a window, its unsavory contents splattering onto the street mere inches from your feet. Dodging these falling missiles of filth was just a regular part of the morning commute. So you might think, surely people wash their hands after handling all this waste. But remember, this was a time before indoor faucets. Most folks had to haul their water from communal wells or nearby rivers, the same rivers that were often used as open sewers, so that water was far from pristine. Let's follow one such river as it winds its way through the town. We come upon a group of women kneeling at the bank, sleeves rolled up as they scrub clothes against the rocks. These medieval washerwomen had a tough job, beating the dirt out of clothing using little more than cold water, lye soap, and elbow grease. The idea of doing laundry in the same place where people dumped waste may seem incredibly unsanitary to us. But without modern detergents and washing machines, it was the best method available at the time. The flowing water, at least, helped to carry away some of the grime. As we leave the washerwomen to their work, we can't help but feel a twinge of sympathy. Theirs was a hard life, full of back-breaking labour, and yet they could never quite escape the stench that pervaded their world. But they did find small joys where they could, in a bit of gossip shared over the washing, or a bawdy song to pass the time. And slowly, as the centuries passed, some changes did begin to take hold. Larger towns started to build primitive sewage systems, using gutters and underground channels to carry waste away from the streets. It was far from perfect, but it was a start. So next time you turn on the tap or flush the toilet, take a moment to appreciate these marvels of modern sanitation, and spare a thought for your medieval ancestors who had to navigate a world where the very water and earth were often tainted by human waste. It's enough to make you grateful for the simple luxury of a clean glass of water and a sanitary sewer system. But our journey through the often grimy history of hygiene has only just begun. Next, we'll explore the intriguing and sometimes alarming bathing practices of the Middle Ages. And trust me, you'll never look at a public bathhouse the same way again. But for now, as you sink deeper into your plush, clean pillow, let the gentle flow of water carry your imagination to a simpler, if not necessarily cleaner time. In our modern world, a daily shower is a standard part of most people's routine. We lather up, rinse off, and start the day feeling fresh and clean. But for our medieval ancestors, bathing was a far more complicated affair, one that didn't happen nearly as often as you might think or hope. You see, many people in the Middle Ages actually feared bathing, believing it could open the pores and let disease into the body. They thought that a layer of dirt could actually protect the skin, like a primitive kind of armour. So most folks only washed their hands and faces on a regular basis, and full-body bathing was a much rarer occurrence. In fact, it was common for even wealthy people to go months or even years without a proper bath. They might splash a little water on their faces or use a damp cloth to wipe down, but immersing the whole body was seen as a risky indulgence. But here's the thing, medieval people weren't oblivious to cleanliness, they just had different ways of achieving it. When they did bathe, it was often a social event, done in public bathhouses where people could gather to gossip, flirt, and yes, get a little bit cleaner. Imagine you're a noble lady, preparing for a long overdue trip to the bathhouse. Your handmaidens help you out of your heavy, ornate clothing and into a simple linen shift. You gather your bathing supplies, a linen towel, a comb, perhaps a scented oil or perfume, and set off with your entourage to the steamy, echoing halls of the bathhouse. As you step inside, the humid air envelops you, thick with the mingled scents of soap and sweat. You see other bathers lounging in large wooden tubs, their skin pink from the heat. Some are engaged in lively conversation, their laughter echoing off the stone walls. Others have their heads bent over a game of dice or cards. You slip off your shift and climb into a tub, sighing as the warm water envelops your skin. A bath attendant offers to scrub your back with a coarse cloth, and you accept, feeling the layers of grime begin to slough away. But as you soak, you can't help but notice the murky colour of the water, and wonder just how many other bodies have bathed in this same tub. It's a far cry from the sparkling clean private bathrooms we enjoy today. But for the people of the Middle Ages, the bathhouse was a place of community and relaxation, even if the hygienic benefits were somewhat dubious. Of course, not everyone had access to bathhouses. For the poor, bathing was an even rarer luxury, often done in rivers or streams when the opportunity arose. And for those who did bathe, the process could be quite different from what we're used to. Without the abundance of soaps and shampoos we have today, medieval people often used harsh lye soaps or even just plain water to wash. They might rub their skin with herbs or oils to add fragrance, or use a rough cloth or sponge to scrape away dirt. It was a far cry from the gentle, foaming cleansers we use now. But perhaps the most famous example of medieval bathing habits, or lack thereof, is the notorious Queen Isabella of Castile. This 15th century Spanish queen was said to have bathed only twice in her entire life, once at birth and once before her wedding day. The rest of the time, she relied on perfumes and scented powders to mask any unpleasant odours. Now, it's hard to say for sure if this story is entirely true, but it does reflect the prevailing attitudes of the time. For many medieval people, bathing was simply not a priority. They had other ways of staying clean, even if those methods might make us cringe today. So, next time you step into your steamy, soapy shower, take a moment to appreciate the luxury. And if you ever find yourself complaining about a lack of hot water or a clogged drain, just remember, at least you're not sharing a tub with a dozen other people in a medieval bathhouse. Although who knows, maybe you'd enjoy the social aspect, if not the hygiene. But speaking of questionable medieval habits, let's turn our attention to another area where cleanliness often fell short: oral hygiene. Brace yourself for some truly cringe-worthy tales of teeth and breath in the Middle Ages. And maybe, just maybe, it will make you a little more diligent about flossing. If you've ever experienced the discomfort of a toothache or the embarrassment of bad breath, you know just how important oral hygiene is to our overall health and well-being. But in the Middle Ages, the state of most people's teeth and gums was enough to make a modern dentist shudder. You see, without fluoride toothpaste, electric toothbrushes, or regular dental checkups, medieval mouths were often a hotbed of decay and disease. Rotting teeth and foul breath were simply a fact of life for many people, regardless of their social class. But that doesn't mean they didn't try to clean their teeth. It just looked a little different than what we're used to. Instead of a toothbrush and minty paste, medieval people might rub their teeth with a cloth or use abrasives like salt, chalk, or even ground up shells to try to scrub away the buildup. Some even used twigs or sticks as a primitive kind of toothbrush. fraying the end to create a bristle-like texture. These early tooth sticks were the precursors to the modern toothbrush, but they were a far cry from the soft-bristled, ergonomically designed tools we use today. But even with these rudimentary methods, dental hygiene was often neglected. Many people only cleaned their teeth occasionally, if at all, and the results were, well, less than pleasant. Take, for example, the infamous oral hygiene of Queen Elizabeth I of England. This 16th century monarch was known for her love of sweets, particularly candied fruits and sugar-coated almonds. But all that sugar took a toll on her teeth, leaving them blackened and decayed. In fact, the Queen's teeth were said to be so rotten that she often stuffed bits of cloth into her mouth to disguise the smell. She also suffered from frequent toothaches, which she tried to treat with all manner of bizarre remedies, from mouthwashes made of vinegar and wine to poultices of herbs and spices. But perhaps the most cringe-worthy detail of Elizabeth's dental woes was the state of her gums. They were reportedly so badly infected that they would bleed and emit pus when she spoke or ate. It's a far cry from the dazzling, pearly white smiles we associate with royalty today. But it wasn't just the Queen who suffered from poor oral hygiene. Throughout the Middle Ages, tooth decay and gum disease were rampant, affecting people of all ages and social classes. And without proper dental care, these problems often led to more serious health issues, like abscesses and even systemic infections. It wasn't until the later medieval period that we start to see some small improvements in oral hygiene. Toothpicks made of gold, silver, or ivory became popular among the wealthy, used to dislodge food particles after meals. And in the 14th century, we see the emergence of tooth powders made from abrasives like pumice, brick dust, or burnt herbs. But perhaps the most surprising dental innovators of the Middle Ages were the barber surgeons. These jack-of-all-trades professionals not only cut hair and trimmed beards, but also performed minor surgeries and dental procedures. Some barber surgeons even specialized in dentistry, crafting false teeth from materials like ivory or bone. They might also extract rotten teeth, drain abscesses, and attempt to fill cavities with materials like lead or beeswax. It was a crude and often painful form of dentistry, but it was the best available at the time. So next time you settle in for your nightly brushing and flossing routine, take a moment to appreciate the minty freshness and relative ease of modern oral hygiene. And if you ever feel tempted to skip a session, just remember the cautionary tale of Queen Elizabeth and her royal tooth decay. But the horrors of medieval hygiene don't stop at the mouth. No, we must venture even further, to the tangled, lice-ridden depths of medieval hair. It's a journey that may make your scalp crawl, but it's all part of the fascinating, if slightly nauseating, history of human cleanliness. In the Middle Ages, hair was not just a matter of personal style or grooming. It was also a major source of discomfort, irritation, and even infestation. Without regular washing, or the benefit of modern shampoos and conditioners, medieval hair was often a tangled, matted mess, crawling with all manner of unpleasant critters. Chief among these unwanted guests were lice. These tiny, wingless insects thrive in human hair, feeding on blood from the scalp and laying their eggs, or nits, on the hair shafts. In the warm, unwashed hair of medieval people, lice found an ideal breeding ground, multiplying and spreading with alarming speed. It wasn't just the poor who suffered from lice infestations. Even the wealthy and powerful were not immune to these itchy, irritating pests. In fact, some of the most famous heads in history were known to be crawling with lice. Take, for example, King Louis XIII of France. This 17th century monarch was renowned for his lush, flowing locks, which he often styled in elaborate curls and ringlets. But beneath the regal exterior, Louis's hair was a veritable zoo of lice and nits. According to contemporary accounts, the king's hair was so infested that his attendants would often find lice crawling across his face and even onto his clothes. He reportedly scratched his scalp incessantly, leaving behind flakes of skin and bits of dead lice. But rather than address the root of the problem with more frequent washing and combing, Louis and other wealthy individuals of the time often resorted to more superficial solutions. They might dust their hair with scented powders or wear elaborate wigs to cover up the evidence of infestation. These wigs, which became increasingly popular in the 17th and 18th centuries, were often made from human or animal hair and styled into towering, elaborate coiffures. But while they may have looked impressive, they were often just as lice-ridden as the natural hair they covered. In fact, the demand for human hair to make these wigs was so high that some enterprising individuals even turned to grave robbing, stealing hair from corpses to sell to wig makers. It's a grim reminder of just how far people were willing to go to maintain the illusion of cleanliness and style. But for the common folk who couldn't afford fancy wigs or powders, dealing with lice was a constant struggle. They might use crude combs made of bone, wood, or ivory to try to remove the pests and their eggs. Some even resorted to shaving their heads entirely, a drastic but effective solution. Others turned to more creative, if not entirely effective, remedies. They might rub their scalps with vinegar, oil, or even mercury in an attempt to kill the lice. Or they might try to smoke them out by holding their heads over a smouldering fire. But perhaps the most unusual approach to lice control was the practice of nitpicking. This involved carefully combing through the hair, strand by strand, to remove lice and nits by hand. It was a tedious and time-consuming process, but it was often the only option for those who couldn't afford other treatments. In fact, nitpicking became such a common practice that it even gave rise to a new profession, the nitpicker. These skilled individuals, often women, would set up shop in towns and villages, offering their services to those suffering from lice infestations. For a small fee, they would meticulously comb through a client's hair, plucking out lice and nits with deft fingers. It was a lucrative business, if not a particularly glamorous one, and it reflects the widespread nature of the lice problem in medieval society. So next time you lather up with your favourite shampoo or run a comb through your clean, shiny hair, take a moment to appreciate the simple joy of a lice-free scowl. Of course, not everyone in medieval Europe could afford the small luxuries of tooth powders or lice combs. For the poorest peasants, even a wisp of scented powder was an unimaginable extravagance. They had little choice but to live with the crawling sensations and constant itch of lice, fleas, and other vermin that made their home in human hair. Perhaps no one understood this harsh reality better than Marjorie Kemp. Born into a middle-class family in the English town of King's Lynn in the late 14th century, Marjorie's fortunes took a turn for the worse when her father's business failed. She found herself married off to a much older man and thrust into poverty. In her spiritual autobiography, The Book of Marjorie Kempe, she describes her family's destitution in painfully vivid terms. They often went without food, huddling together in a cramped, unheated room. But even more tormenting than the hunger and cold were the fleas and lice that feasted on their unwashed bodies. Marjorie recounts long, sleepless nights spent clawing at her itching skin until it bled. She wrote of how the vermin skittered across her face in the dark, how they nested in the tangled mat of her hair. For Marjorie, and countless others in her position, this was not a temporary hardship, but an inescapable fact of life. Yet even in the face of such misery, the human spirit could still soar to unexpected heights. Marjorie Kempe went on to become one of the most significant religious figures of her day, undertaking pilgrimages across Europe and leaving behind a spiritual autobiography that stands as one of the earliest known works in the English language written by a woman. Her story reminds us that even in the filthiest and most wretched conditions, the light of human resilience and potential could never be fully extinguished. It's a testament to the unbreakable nature of the human spirit. A spirit that could endure even the most insufferable torments inflicted by lice, fleas, and the many other plagues of the medieval world. as we've journeyed together through the grime and squalor of the Middle Ages. I hope you've come to see this era not just as a time of unrelenting filth, but also as a deeply human age. An age of people not so different from you and I, who fought against the constraints of their time with whatever knowledge and resources they had. Their struggles paved the way for the advances in hygiene that we often take for granted today. So the next time you take a hot shower, brush your teeth with minty toothpaste, or slip into a freshly laundered set of clothes, take a moment to remember and appreciate those who came before. Their stories may be stained with grime and clouded by the mists of history, but they are no less a part of the human story, a story of progress, of resilience, and of the eternal search for a better, cleaner, more comfortable life. And with that, our journey through the muck and mire of medieval hygiene comes to an end. If you've enjoyed our stroll through this pungent past, be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more meandering voyages through the often amusing, sometimes shocking, but always fascinating annals of history. Until our next adventure, this is your faithful chronicler of chronicles, your weaver of bygone yarns, bidding you a fond and freshly scented farewell. May your dreams be as sweet as a medieval queen's perfumed handkerchief, and decidedly less lice-ridden.